Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Homecoming Shadows. The desert dust had barely settled from Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson's boots when the process server appeared at his door. 4 tours in Afghanistan, 3 Purple Hearts, and 2 Bronze Stars. None of it prepared him for the papers thrust into his calloused hands. Child support. $10,000 monthly. For twins he'd never seen. Joseph stood in the doorway of his sparse apartment, reading the documents with the same methodical precision he'd once used to disarm IDs. His wife Shelby had filed while he was overseas, claiming their marriage had produced twin boys, now 3 years old. The math was simple. He'd been deployed when these children were supposedly conceived. His phone buzzed. A text from his old unit commander, Colonel Gerald Garrison. "Welcome home, soldier. Heard about the legal troubles. Coffee tomorrow." Joseph's jaw tightened. News traveled fast in military circles. He'd built his reputation on being unbreakable, unmovable, and utterly loyal. But loyalty, he was learning, was a one-way street. The apartment felt alien after 18 months in the mountains of Kandahar. Shelby had redecorated, expensive furniture, high-end electronics, designer clothes scattered across surfaces. On his sergeant's salary, none of this should have been affordable. His wedding photo sat face down on the nightstand, replaced by glamorous selfies of Shelby in places he'd never been. Joseph methodically searched the apartment, his training kicking in. In the bedroom closet, behind designer dresses, he found a shoebox. Inside, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, jewelry he'd never bought her. All dated during his deployments. All signed with 2 names, Shelby Nelson and Alan Reeves. Alan Reeves. Joseph knew that name. City Planning Commissioner, recently appointed to oversee military base housing contracts. A man who'd made his fortune while Joseph bled for his country. The front door opened. Shelby walked in, no longer the sweet small-town girl he'd married 5 years ago. Designer heels clicked against hardwood floors, her blonde hair professionally styled, lips painted crimson. She stopped short seeing him, her blue eyes flashing with something between guilt and defiance. "Joseph." Her voice was different, colder, calculated. "I didn't expect you back so soon." Evidently. He held up the legal papers. "Care to explain?" Shelby lifted her chin, the innocent act dissolving. "You were never here. I had needs. Alan provided what you couldn't: stability, presence, a future, and children. Those boys deserve better than a father who chooses war over family." She moved to the bar cart, pouring herself wine with steady hands. "Alan's been more of a father to them than you ever could be." Joseph studied her like he would an enemy combatant. "Where are they?" "Safe. With their real father." The words hit like shrapnel designed to wound. "Alan's lawyers say you'll pay or face garnishment. Military pension, disability, everything." "I see." Joseph's voice remained level, but his eyes had gone cold, the same look that had preceded every successful mission. "And if I refuse?" Shelby smiled, confident in her victory. "Then you'll learn what happens to deadbeat dads. Alan has connections. Joseph. Judges, politicians, people who matter. You're just a broken soldier with PTSD. Who do you think they'll believe?" She was right about one thing. Joseph was broken, but not in the way she imagined. 4 tours had stripped away everything soft, everything forgiving. What remained was pure predator, honed by years of hunting men through mountain caves and urban hellscapes. "I'll need to see them," he said finally. "The boys." "Absolutely not." Shelby's mask slipped. "Alan won't allow it. Alan doesn't get a vote. I'm still legally their father until proven otherwise." Panic flashed across her features. "Joseph, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Take the deal. Pay the support. We can all move on." But Joseph was already moving, his mind shifting into tactical mode. Court date. Next Friday, 10 a.m. Judge Morrison presiding. She seemed relieved by his apparent acceptance. "Just don't fight this, Joseph. You can't win." After she left, to Alan's house, he assumed, Joseph sat in the gathering darkness. Around him, the apartment felt like a forward operating base in enemy territory. which he realized it was. His phone rang. Gerald Garrison. How bad is it, son? They think they're fighting a desperate veteran, Joseph said. They're wrong. What do you need? Everything you can find on Alan Reeves. And Gerald? This stays between us. A pause. Roger that. Joseph? Whatever you're planning is necessary. Joseph ended the call and stared at the photo of Shelby and Alan on the nightstand. In it, they stood before a luxury hotel, her hand resting on the man's chest, both laughing at some private joke. Joseph had killed men for less than what they'd done to him. But death was quick, merciful. What he had planned would last much longer. Chapter 2. Intelligence Gathering. Colonel Gerald Garrison arrived at the coffee shop with a thick manila folder and the grim expression of a man delivering bad news. Joseph sat in the corner booth, positioned to watch all entrances, old habits that had kept him alive in Hellman Province. Alan Reeves, Gerald said, sliding the folder across the table. 42, divorced twice, no kids of his own until now. Built his fortune on military construction contracts, base housing specifically. Joseph flipped through surveillance photos, financial records, property deeds. Gerald's intelligence network was thorough. He's been busy while I was away. Gets worse. Those housing contracts? They're cutting corners. Substandard materials, safety violations covered up. Military families living in conditions that would make a Taliban cave look luxurious. Gerald's jaw worked with suppressed anger. But here's the interesting part. Someone's been feeding him inside information. Someone with access to base engineering reports, inspection schedules, competitive bid information. Someone in uniform. Has to be. The question is who? Gerald studied Joseph's face. What are you thinking? Joseph was thinking about improvised explosive devices. How the smallest component, placed correctly, could bring down an entire building. I need to see these twins. Joseph, they're using children as weapons, Gerald. That crosses a line. Joseph's voice carried the same quiet menace that had once made Taliban fighters surrender rather than face him in close quarters. I need you to arrange a meeting. With Shelby. With Alan Reeves. Gerald looked skeptical. Why would he agree to that? Because I'm going to offer him what every greedy man wants. More money than he can imagine. That afternoon, Joseph drove to the offices of Reeves Development Corporation. The building was new, gleaming glass and steel that screamed of military contract money. The lobby displayed photos of Alan shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at base housing projects, smiling beside uniformed officers. Alan Reeves was everything Joseph expected. Soft, manicured, the kind of man who'd never missed a meal or slept in the mud. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of barely concealed smugness as he gestured Joseph into his corner office. Sergeant Nelson, I've heard so much about you. Alan's handshake was weak, his palm damp. Please sit. The office walls were covered with awards, photos, and architectural plans. Joseph's trained eye caught details others might miss. Multiple phones, a safe behind a painting, security cameras positioned to monitor approaches to the building. This man lived in fear despite his confident facade. Understand you've been caring for my wife, Joseph said, settling into the leather chair like a coiled spring. Alan's smile faltered slightly. Shelby is a remarkable woman. She deserves better than being abandoned for years at a time. She deserves security. I respect that. Joseph pulled out a cashier's check, placing it on the desk. 100,000. A gesture of goodwill. Alan's eyes fixed on the check. For what? The boys. I want to establish a relationship with them. Gradually, of course. Under supervised conditions. Joseph leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to fight you, Mr. Reeves. I'm here to make a deal. What kind of deal? I have skills your business could use. Security, consulting, overseas construction projects, navigating military bureaucracy. Joseph gestured at the awards on the wall. You've built an empire on military contracts. I can help you expand it. Alan's greed was almost palpable. What exactly are you proposing? Partnership. I bring you access to classified construction projects, advanced knowledge of contract opportunities, inside information on competing bids. Joseph watched Alan's pupils dilate with avarice. In exchange, I want access to my sons and a reduction in child support obligations. Illegal access to classified information? Alan tried to look shocked, but his voice carried eager undertones. Gray areas. The kind of intelligence gathering that's technically legal but ethically questionable. Joseph shrugged. I spent 4 tours learning how the system really works. That knowledge is valuable. Alan was quiet for several minutes, his businessman's mind calculating possibilities. I need proof of concept, something that demonstrates your capabilities. Joseph had expected this. He pulled out a second folder. Next month's housing contract bids for Fort Braxton. Your competitors' proposals, budget breakdowns, personnel assignments. He opened the folder slightly, letting Alan glimpse the classified stamps. Consider it a down payment. Alan's breathing quickened. How did you? I have friends who trust me. The question is whether you're smart enough to profit from that trust. Joseph closed the folder and stood. I'll need an answer by tomorrow, and I'll need to meet my sons this weekend. As Joseph walked toward the door, Alan called out, the child support will be renegotiated once our partnership proves profitable. Joseph paused at the door. One more thing, Mr. Reeves. I don't forgive betrayal, business or personal. Keep that in mind. Outside the building, Joseph sat in his truck and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Gerald Garrison. It started. The second was to Lieutenant Craig Goldstein, a JAG lawyer who owed Joseph his life from Kandahar. Craig, I need you to file papers on my behalf. Today. What kind of papers? Paternity test for the twins, emergency custody hearing, and fraud charges against Shelby. Joseph watched Alan's office window, seeing the man pacing frantically. Also, I need you to research something for me. What happens to child support obligations when the requesting party is found guilty of identity theft? Joseph, what have you gotten yourself into? Justice, Craig. Old Testament style. That evening, Shelby called, her voice shrill with panic. What did you do? Alan is furious. He says you threatened him. I offered him a business opportunity. He seemed interested. Joseph stood on his apartment balcony, watching the sun set over the city where he'd been born and raised, where he'd married the woman who now saw him as nothing more than a paycheck. Did you tell him about our conversation? Of course I did. We don't keep secrets. Good. Honesty is important in a relationship. Joseph smiled grimly. By the way, I've filed for a paternity test. Court ordered. You'll receive the papers tomorrow. The line went silent. Then, Joseph, please, don't destroy what we've built. Shelby, he said softly, what you built was a lie. I'm just revealing the foundation. After hanging up, Joseph opened his laptop and began typing. The first document was a detailed letter to the FBI's fraud division, outlining suspicious activities in military contract awards. The second was a comprehensive dossier on Alan Reeves' business practices, compiled from Gerald's intelligence and Joseph's own observations. But the third document was the most important, a step-by-step plan for the complete destruction of everyone who had betrayed him. He'd learned in Afghanistan that the best operations were the ones where the enemy destroyed themselves. Joseph was simply going to light the fuse. Chapter 3. First Contact. The court-mandated meeting took place at a family services center supervised by a social worker named Johanna Woods. Joseph arrived early, sitting in the sterile waiting room with the same patients he'd once used in Sniper Hides. When Shelby and Alan arrived with the twins, Joseph felt something twist in his chest. The boys were beautiful. Dark hair, serious brown eyes, quiet demeanor that reminded him of himself at that age. They clung to Alan, eyeing Joseph with the wariness of children who'd been told he was dangerous. Boys, this is Joseph, Shelby said, her voice artificially bright. He's a friend. The older twin, Marcus, according to the files, stepped forward with the solemnity of a miniature adult. Are you the soldier man? I am. Joseph knelt to the boy's level, his scarred hands gentle despite their capacity for violence. What else did they tell you about me? That you hurt people for money, the younger twin, Michael, whispered. Joseph's eyes flicked to Alan, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. I protect people. Actually, that's what soldiers do. For the next hour, Joseph played with children who bore no resemblance to him. answered their questions about war with age-appropriate honesty, and felt his rage crystallize into something harder and colder than diamond. These boys weren't pawns in his war with Shelby. They were innocent casualties of her deception. When the session ended, Alan lingered as Shelby gathered the children. "About that business proposition," he said quietly. "Still interested?" "Very, but I need guarantees. Protection." Joseph smiled without warmth. "Mr. Reeves, I spent 4 tours keeping people alive in the world's most dangerous places. I know all about protection." That evening, Joseph received a text message from an unknown number. "The boys love you already. Don't ruin this." It was Shelby, he realized, using a new phone. He responded, "DNA results tomorrow. Then we'll see who's ruining what." The next morning brought 2 pieces of news. First, Craig Goldstein called with the paternity results. "You're not the father, Joseph. Not even close. Want me to file fraud charges?" "Not yet. Let me handle this my way first." The second call was from Gerald Garrison, Founder Leak. "Major Sergio Strickland, Base Engineering Division. Been feeding information to Reeves for 2 years. But here's the twist. He's not doing it for money." "Then why?" "Blackmail. Alan has photos of Strickland with a local prostitute. Turns out she's 17, though she looks older. Strickland didn't know, but try explaining that to a court-martial." Joseph felt the pieces clicking into place. "Where's Strickland now?" "Fort Braxton. Engineering office." "Joseph, if you're planning what I think you're planning, I need 24 hours, Gerald. After that, you can arrest everyone involved." Joseph drove to Fort Braxton, using his military ID to access the base. He found Major Strickland hunched over engineering reports in an empty office building, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Sergio," Joseph said, closing the office door behind him. Strickland spun around, his face going pale. "Sergeant Nelson, I heard you were back. I hear you've been busy while I was away, feeding classified information to civilian contractors." Joseph sat down across from Strickland's desk. "How long has Alan Reeves been blackmailing you?" The Major's composure cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about." Joseph pulled out his phone, showing Strickland a photo Gerald had provided. The Major entering a motel with a young woman. 17, Sergio. "Though I'm betting you didn't know that when Alan's photographer captured this moment." Strickland buried his face in his hands. "Jesus Christ. How did you?" "I make it my business to know who's betraying their oath." Joseph leaned back in his chair. "The question is what you're going to do about it." "I can't stop. Alan has other photos, videos. My career, my family. Would all be destroyed if this came out," Joseph finished. "But what if I told you there was a way to end this? To destroy Alan Reeves completely while protecting yourself?" Strickland looked up, hope and desperation warring in his eyes. "Ow!" Joseph smiled, and for the first time in days it was genuine, by giving him exactly what he wants. Over the next hour, Joseph outlined his plan. Strickland would continue feeding information to Alan, but now the intelligence would be carefully crafted by Joseph and Gerald. Fake contract opportunities, false inspection schedules, fabricated competitive bids, all designed to lead Alan deeper into a trap of his own greed. "He'll bid on projects that don't exist," Joseph explained. "Invest in materials for contracts he'll never win. By the time he realizes what's happening, he'll have committed federal fraud on a massive scale." "And the blackmail?" "Handled. Alan Reeves will have bigger problems than compromising photos." Joseph stood to leave. "One more thing, Sergio. After this is over, you're going to resign your commission and disappear. Quietly. Because if I ever see you again, blackmail will be the least of your worries." That night, Joseph called Alan Reeves. "I have something you'll want to see. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Warehouse District, 1247, Industrial Boulevard." "What kind of something?" "The kind that will make you the largest military contractor on the East Coast." Joseph hung up before Alan could respond. Then he called Shelby. DNA results came back. A long pause. "And we need to talk. All 3 of us. Tomorrow night." Joseph gave her the same address. "Bring the boys. They should hear the truth from their real father." "Joseph, please." 8:30, Shelby. "Don't be late." Joseph spent the rest of the evening preparing the warehouse. cameras, recording equipment, and other tools of the trade he'd learned in special operations. By tomorrow night, everything would be in place. The trap would be set, and his enemies would walk willingly into their own destruction. He thought about the twins, Marcus and Michael, and felt a pang of genuine sorrow. They deserved better than the parents they'd been given. But Joseph had learned long ago that innocence was often the first casualty of war. Tomorrow night, Shelby and Alan would learn what happened when you declared war on someone who fought for a living. The revenge was going to be methodical, brutal, and absolutely final. Joseph Nelson didn't believe in second chances. Chapter 4. The Setup. The warehouse in the industrial district had been abandoned for 2 years, its windows dark and loading docks empty. Joseph arrived 3 hours early, transforming the cavernous space into a theater of his own design. Hidden cameras captured every angle, recording equipment hummed quietly in the shadows, and carefully placed lighting would ensure perfect visibility for what was to come. At 7 p.m., Major Strickland arrived as instructed, carrying a briefcase full of fabricated documents. "Are you sure about this, Sergeant?" "In my experience, people destroy themselves," Joseph replied, adjusting a camera angle. "We're just providing the opportunity." Alan Reeves arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, his expensive sedan gleaming under the warehouse's security lights. He entered cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with the surroundings, but driven by greed stronger than his fear. "This is dramatic, even for you," Alan said, his voice echoing in the empty space. Joseph stepped from the shadows, Strickland beside him. "Mr. Reeves, I believe you know Major Strickland." Alan's eyes widened, then narrowed. "What is this?" "Business," Joseph said simply. "The Major has information you'll find extremely valuable." "Sergio." Strickland opened his briefcase with shaking hands. "Fort Braxton is expanding. New housing contracts worth $200 million. The bidding process is rigged. I can guarantee your company wins every contract." Alan's businessman instincts warred with his survival instincts. "And in exchange, 20% of all contract values paid to offshore accounts will provide," Joseph said, "plus guaranteed protection from any military investigations." "This is conspiracy to commit federal fraud," Alan said, but his voice carried excitement rather than concern. "This is opportunity," Joseph corrected, "the kind that comes once in a lifetime." Alan studied the documents Strickland provided, falsified bid specifications, fabricated project timelines, fake budget allocations. To his greedy eyes, they represented a fortune beyond imagination. "I'll need guarantees," Alan said finally. "Protection if something goes wrong." Joseph smiled coldly. "You'll have the protection of everyone involved having too much to lose. Mutual assured destruction, civilian style." At 8:30, headlights swept across the warehouse walls. Shelby's SUV pulled up outside, the twins visible in their car seats. Joseph felt his jaw tighten. Bringing children to this confrontation violated every rule of engagement he'd ever known. Shelby entered alone, leaving the boys in the vehicle. She wore the same confident mask she'd worn in the apartment, but Joseph could see cracks forming around the edges. "Alan," she looked between the 3 men with growing unease. "What's going on?" "Business," Alan said, possessive hands settling on her shoulders. "Your husband is helping us secure our future." "Our future?" Joseph's voice carried Arctic cold. Interesting choice of words. He pulled out the DNA test results, holding them where both Shelby and Alan could see. "These boys aren't mine, Shelby. We both know that. The question is whether Alan knows who their real father is." The color drained from Shelby's face. "Joseph, please." "Please what?" "Please continue paying child support for another man's children. Please ignore the fact that my wife has been committing fraud." Joseph stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Or please pretend I don't know about your other secret." Alan frowned. "What secret?" Joseph pulled out a second set of documents. Financial records Gerald had obtained through military intelligence channels. "Your girlfriend has been busy while you two have been playing house. Corporate accounts, property transfers, investment portfolios, all in her name alone." Alan grabbed the papers, his face darkening as he read. Shelby, what is this? I was protecting us, she said quickly. If something happened to you. Protecting yourself, Alan snarled. You've been stealing from me. Not stealing. Planning. Shelby's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. You think I'd tie my future to a man who bribes military officers? I know what you've been doing, Alan. The substandard housing, the safety violations, the bribes. Did you really think I was too stupid to figure it out? The warehouse fell silent except for the hum of recording equipment. Joseph watched with professional interest as his enemies turned on each other, exactly as he'd predicted. You bitch, Alan breathed. You've been playing me from the beginning. Just like you played that major, Shelby shot back, gesturing at Strickland. Did you think I didn't know about the blackmail? About the underage girl? Joseph felt satisfaction wash over him. Everything was proceeding perfectly. Gentlemen, lady, perhaps we should discuss the real reason we're here. He activated a wall-mounted monitor, displaying surveillance footage from outside Alan's office building. The timestamp showed earlier that day, FBI agents entering the lobby, federal prosecutors carrying boxes of evidence from Alan's office. While you two have been arguing, federal investigators have been very busy, Joseph said conversationally. Seems someone provided them with detailed evidence of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy involving military contracts. Alan went pale. You son of a bitch. You set us up. I gave you exactly what you wanted, more classified information than you could handle. Unfortunately for you, everything Major Strickland provided was fabricated. False documents, fake contracts, non-existent projects. Joseph's smile was razor-sharp. But your enthusiastic participation in the conspiracy was very real, very recorded, very illegal. Shelby backed toward the door. Alan, we need to leave. Now. Nobody's leaving, Joseph said quietly, and something in his voice stopped her cold. We haven't discussed the children yet. He gestured toward the SUV outside, where Marcus and Michael sat waiting. Those boys deserve better than being used as weapons in your schemes. They deserve a father who won't abandon them when federal investigators come calling. You're not their father, Shelby spat. No, but I know who is. Joseph pulled out a final document. Private investigator reports, DNA analysis, financial records. Ricardo Santos, construction foreman for Reeves Development. Married man, 3 other children, currently in federal custody for immigration violations. Alan's face went ashen. Santos? But he's the father of your girlfriend's twins. The man whose false immigration papers you provided in exchange for cheap labor. The man who's now cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for deportation instead of prison. Joseph's voice carried grim satisfaction. Funny how quickly loyalty disappears when federal prosecutors start offering deals. The warehouse erupted in shouting. Alan screaming betrayal at Shelby. Shelby denying everything. Strickland pleading for protection that wouldn't come. Joseph watched the chaos with the detached interest of a predator observing wounded prey. Enough! His command voice, honed by years of leading men in combat, cut through the noise like a blade. You want to know what happens next? I'll tell you. Joseph activated the surveillance equipment, showing them feeds from outside. Federal agents surrounded the building, their vehicles blocking every exit. Alan, you're going to federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and bribery. Military contractors who steal from soldiers get special treatment in federal facilities. You'll love it. Shelby, you're facing fraud charges for the fake child support, identity theft for stealing my financial information, and accessory charges for Alan's crimes. The boys will go into foster care while the courts sort out their real parentage. Major Strickland, you're being court-martialed for treason, reduced in rank, and dishonorably discharged. Your pension is forfeit, your benefits revoked. Joseph paused, letting the weight of their destruction settle over them. But here's the beautiful part. I'm walking away clean. Everything I did was legal, if ethically questionable. Everything you did was federal felony. Shelby's composure finally shattered completely. Joseph, please. The boys need stability. Don't let them suffer for our mistakes. Our mistakes. Joseph's laugh was devoid of humor. You chose greed over loyalty, betrayal over honor. You used innocent children as weapons against a man who never did anything but love you and serve his country. He moved toward the door, pausing beside Shelby. You wanted to know what happened to the man you married? He died somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, killed by the knowledge that the woman he loved was betraying him while he bled for strangers. What replaced him doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, doesn't take prisoners. As Joseph stepped outside, federal agents moved in. Through the warehouse windows, he could see Alan and Shelby being placed in handcuffs, their shouts of protest echoing across the empty industrial district. Gerald Garrison appeared beside Joseph's truck. Clean work. It's not finished yet, Joseph said, watching as Marcus and Michael were led away by social services. Those boys need a real father, not a deportee or a convict. What are you thinking? Joseph started his truck, his face hard with resolve. I'm thinking it's time for Ricardo Santos to have a very important conversation with federal prosecutors about cooperation, deportation, and permanent severance of parental rights. As he drove away from the warehouse, Joseph felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion. Revenge was a meal best served cold, but it always left him hungry for something else, something he'd lost in the mountains of Afghanistan and would never get back. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, he had enemies to destroy and innocents to protect. In Joseph Nelson's world, there was rarely a difference between the two. Chapter 5. Federal Complications. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as Joseph sat in the witness waiting room, reviewing his testimony one final time. 3 weeks had passed since the warehouse confrontation, and the wheels of justice were grinding forward with mechanical precision. Alan Reeves sat in federal detention, unable to make bail on charges that included conspiracy, bribery, and fraud. Shelby had been released pending trial, but faced financial ruin as her assets were frozen by federal seizure orders. U.S. Attorney Marla Schneider entered the waiting room, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor with an airtight case. Sergeant Nelson, thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Just doing my civic duty, Joseph replied, though both of them knew his motivations ran deeper than patriotism. The defense attorneys will try to paint you as a vengeful ex-husband seeking retribution, Schneider warned. They'll claim you orchestrated this entire operation purely for personal revenge. Joseph's smile was thin. Will they? That seems like a dangerous strategy, considering I'm the primary witness against their clients. Through the courthouse windows, Joseph could see protesters gathering, military families demanding justice for substandard base housing, veterans groups calling for harsher penalties for contract fraud. The case had become a symbol of everything wrong with military privatization, and public opinion strongly favored the prosecution. Craig Goldstein appeared in the doorway, carrying a thick file folder. Joseph, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Ricardo Santos. He's refusing to cooperate with child services regarding parental rights termination. Claims he wants custody of the twins when he's deported to Mexico. Joseph felt cold fury rising in his chest. Explain. Santos thinks he can use the boys as leverage for a better deal with immigration authorities. Stay in the U.S., reduce charges, possible path to citizenship. Craig sat down heavily. Immigration law is complex, but blood relation carries significant weight in custody hearings. Even when the father is a convicted felon facing deportation, even then, the courts prioritize biological parents over all other considerations unless abuse or neglect can be proven. Craig opened his file. Santos has been advised by his attorney that parental rights could be his ticket to remaining in the country. Joseph stood and walked to the window, watching the protesters below. Among them, he noticed several familiar faces, soldiers from his old unit, veterans he'd served with in Afghanistan. They were here to support him, to see justice done. But justice, he was learning, was a complicated concept when children were involved. What about the foster family? Joseph asked. Lou and Carlos Jarvis. Good people, but temporary placement only. They can't adopt while Santos maintains parental rights. Craig hesitated. Joseph, there's something else. Social Services is recommending the boys be placed with Santos's extended family in Mexico if he's deported. Absolutely not. Joseph's voice carried the same finality he'd once used to end Taliban negotiations. Those children are American citizens. They stay in America. Then we need Santos to voluntarily terminate his rights. And he's not going to do that unless he gets something in return. Joseph turned from the window, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. Set up a meeting. Santos, his attorney, immigration officials. Today. Joseph, what are you planning? Justice. The kind that actually protects innocents instead of rewarding parasites. 2 hours later, Joseph sat across a steel table from Ricardo Santos in the Federal Detention Center's interview room. Santos was smaller than expected, nervous eyes darting between Joseph, his public defender Paulette Perry, and immigration attorney Gerald Garrison. Joseph had called in every favor to get Gerald appointed to handle Santos's case. Mr. Santos, Joseph began in fluent Spanish. We need to discuss your children. Santos straightened, his machismo asserting itself despite his orange jumpsuit. They're my sons. My blood. Your blood that you abandoned when you chose to work illegally and commit identity fraud. Joseph replied, still in Spanish. Your blood that you never supported, never claimed, never protected. Santos's attorney leaned forward. My client is willing to discuss cooperation in exchange for considerations regarding his immigration status. Joseph switched back to English. Mr. Santos, I'm going to make you an offer. One time only. He pulled out a document packet, meticulously prepared, legally reviewed, tactically devastating. Full voluntary termination of parental rights. Your sons remain in American foster care with possibility of adoption by qualified families. In exchange, Immigration and Customs Enforcement reduces your charges to misdemeanor immigration violations. Time served, voluntary deportation with possibility of legal reentry in 5 years. Santos frowned, clearly struggling with the English. His attorney translated rapidly, her expression growing darker as she read the fine print. This is extortion, Perry said. You're threatening my client with maximum penalties unless he abandons his children. I'm offering your client a choice, Joseph corrected. Accept responsibility for his crimes and make decisions in his children's best interests, or face the full consequences of federal prosecution while his sons grow up in institutional care. Gerald Garrison slid another document across the table. Alternative scenario. Mr. Santos fights deportation and parental rights termination. He loses both, spends 3 years in federal prison, gets deported anyway, and his children remain in permanent foster care because the legal battle prevents adoption proceedings. Santos looked between the documents, the weight of impossible choices evident on his face. What guarantee do I have? You have my word, Joseph said simply, and my word has kept men alive in places where angels fear to tread. Santos's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Santos waved her off. In Spanish, he asked Joseph, why do you care what happens to children that aren't yours? Joseph leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of 4 tours and a lifetime of making hard decisions. Because a real man protects innocence even when it costs him everything. Because those boys deserve better than being pawns in adult games. Because someone needs to put their interests first. The room fell silent. Through the reinforced glass windows, Joseph could see federal agents moving through the detention center corridors, processing the endless stream of people who'd gambled with American law and lost. Santos spoke slowly in English. If I sign, my boys stay in America? Get good families. The best families we can find. Educated, stable, loving parents who will raise them as American citizens with American opportunities. Joseph paused. But it has to be your choice, Santos. Not coerced, not forced. Your decision as their father. Santos stared at the termination papers for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet but resolved. My sons, they deserve better than a father in prison, a father who cannot protect them. He signed the documents with a shaking hand, each signature sealing his fate and freeing his children. When he finished, Santos looked directly at Joseph. You will watch over them? Make sure they are safe. You have my word. As they prepared to leave, Santos's attorney made one final attempt. Ricardo, the giving up everything. Your children, your chance at citizenship, your future in America. Santos stood slowly, dignity intact despite his circumstances. No, I am giving my children their future in America. That is what a father does. Outside the detention center, Gerald Garrison shook his head in amazement. In 20 years of immigration law, I've never seen anything like that. You didn't threaten him, didn't coerce him. You just convinced him to do the right thing. Sometimes the best weapon is the truth, Joseph replied. Santos is a decent man who made bad choices. When given the opportunity to choose his children's welfare over his own interests, he chose correctly. Craig Goldstein was waiting by Joseph's truck with more paperwork. Foster family approval, adoption pre-qualification, family court scheduling. This is moving fast. How fast? If everything goes smoothly, Marcus and Michael could be placed with permanent families within 6 months. Craig studied Joseph's face. What about you? Have you considered applying for custody yourself? Joseph looked back at the detention center, thinking about Santos signing away his parental rights to give his children a better life. I'm not father material, Craig. I'm a soldier. I protect people, I don't raise them. Maybe it's time to learn the difference. As Joseph drove away from the courthouse, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The boys ask about you every day. Foster family says you can visit anytime. Jay Woods, Social Services. Joseph stared at the message for a long moment. Marcus and Michael, innocent casualties of adult warfare, now caught between their biological father's sacrifice and their mother's betrayal. They deserved stability, safety, and love. Whether Joseph was capable of providing any of those things remained to be seen. Tomorrow, Shelby and Alan would face their first court appearances. Tomorrow, the media circus would intensify. Tomorrow, justice would continue its slow, grinding advance. But today, 2 little boys were safe, their future secured by their father's sacrifice and their former stepfather's protection. In Joseph's experience, small victories were often the most important ones. The war wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. Chapter 6, Courtroom Warfare. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed beyond capacity, spectators spilling into the hallway as the military contracting fraud trial of the decade got underway. Media crews lined the walls, their cameras focused on the defendant's table, where Alan Reeves sat beside his high-powered defense attorney, Cora McGrath, a woman whose reputation for winning impossible cases was exceeded only by her fees. Joseph sat in the witness gallery, his dress blues pristine, his bearing ramrod straight. Around him, other veterans filled the courtroom. Men and women who'd lived in the substandard housing Alan's company had built, who trusted their lives to construction that prioritized profit over safety. U.S. Attorney Marla Schneider rose for opening statements, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about betrayal of the highest order. The defendant, Alan Reeves, systematically defrauded the United States military, endangering the lives of service members and their families for personal profit. She gestured toward a display showing photographs of mold-infested military housing, collapsed roofing, and electrical fires. While our soldiers fought overseas, the defendant was waging war on their families at home, providing substandard housing that put children at risk and families in danger. McGrath's response was predictably aggressive. Members of the jury, my client is the victim of an elaborate revenge plot orchestrated by psychologically damaged veteran seeking retribution against his ex-wife. Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson used his military training and connections to frame an innocent businessman, manufacturing evidence and manipulating witnesses to serve his personal vendetta. Joseph felt eyes turning toward him throughout the courtroom. McGrath was playing the only card available to her. Make Joseph the villain and Alan the victim. It was a dangerous strategy, but one that might create reasonable doubt. The first day of testimony focused on the technical aspects of Alan's construction contracts. Structural engineers testified about safety violations. Military housing inspectors detailed cover-ups and falsified reports. The evidence was damning. But Joseph knew the real battle would come when character witnesses took the stand. During the lunch recess, Craig Goldstein pulled Joseph aside. McGrath's bringing in a psychological expert to testify about PTSD and its effects on judgment and behavior. She's going to argue that your entire operation was the product of a damaged psyche seeking revenge. Let her try, Joseph said calmly. My psychological evaluations are part of the military record. 4 tours, 3 Purple Hearts, no psychological disability rating. That's not the point. She doesn't need to prove you're clinically damaged, just that your judgment was compromised by personal motivation. Craig lowered his voice. There's something else. Shelby's agreed to testify for the defense. Joseph felt his blood pressure spike. In exchange for what? Reduced charges on her fraud case. Community service instead of prison time. Craig looked uncomfortable. Joseph, she's going to testify that you threatened her, that you coerced her into the warehouse meeting, that everything was orchestrated to destroy her relationship with Alan. And people will believe her. Grieving wife, mother separated from her children, facing financial ruin? Juries are sympathetic to that narrative. Craig hesitated. Unless we can find a way to discredit her testimony. Joseph smiled grimly. Don't worry about Shelby. I know exactly how to handle her. That afternoon, the prosecution called Major Sergio Strickland to testify. The disgraced officer looked broken as he took the oath, his uniform replaced with civilian clothes. His military bearing collapsed under the weight of his shame. Major Strickland, Schneider began, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. Strickland's voice was barely audible. Alan Reeves blackmailed me into providing classified military information. He used photographs of me with a minor to force my cooperation. McGrath objected immediately. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness is testifying about alleged blackmail that has never been proven. I'll allow it, Judge Morrison ruled. The witness may continue. For the next hour, Strickland detailed 2 years of systematic blackmail, forced cooperation, and military information trafficking. His testimony was devastating, but Joseph could see McGrath preparing her counterattack. Major Strickland, McGrath began her cross-examination. Isn't it true that you're facing court-martial for treason and are testifying here in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence? Yes, ma'am. And isn't it true that your initial contact with my client was facilitated by Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson, who provided you with fabricated information to pass along? Strickland hesitated. Sergeant Nelson told me to continue providing information, but by then... So, Sergeant Nelson was directing your actions? Telling you what information to provide to my client? In the final stages, yes, but... Thank you, Major. No further questions. Joseph watched the jury's faces, seeing doubt creeping in. McGrath was skillfully painting him as the puppet master, manipulating everyone around him for personal revenge. The strategy was working. On the second day, Shelby took the stand. She'd lost weight during the weeks since the warehouse confrontation. Her designer clothes were replaced with conservative attire designed to evoke sympathy. Her performance was masterful. The grieving wife, the protective mother, the woman driven to desperate measures by her husband's abandonment. I never intended to hurt anyone, she testified, tears streaming down her face. I was alone, raising children without support, trying to survive while my husband chose war over family. McGrath guided her through testimony designed to portray Joseph as controlling, manipulative, and vengeful. Did your husband threaten you regarding your relationship with Mr. Reeves? Constantly. He said he would destroy anyone who betrayed him. He said he didn't forgive and didn't forget. Shelby looked directly at Joseph. I was terrified of what he might do. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal but careful. Schneider systematically dismantled Shelby's victim narrative, highlighting her financial deception, her fraud schemes, her manipulation of innocent children. Mrs. Nelson, you filed for child support claiming the defendant was the father of your twins, correct? Yes. Despite knowing that your husband was not the biological father. I thought he might be. The timing was unclear. But DNA testing proved definitively that he was not the father, correct? Yes. And you never corrected this filing with the court, even after learning the truth. Shelby's composure began to crack. I was confused, frightened. You were committing fraud to extract money from a man serving his country overseas, weren't you? Objection, McGrath shouted. Sustained, Judge Morrison ruled, but the damage was done. The jury had seen through Shelby's performance to the calculating predator beneath. When court recessed for the day, Joseph found himself surrounded by reporters and veterans advocates. The story had captured national attention. The wounded warrior seeking justice against the corrupt contractor and faithless wife. Public opinion was solidly on his side, but jury verdicts weren't determined by public opinion. That evening, Gerald Garrison called with an update on the twins. Marcus and Michael are doing well in foster care. The Jarvis family is interested in permanent adoption if parental rights can be fully terminated. What about Santos? Deported yesterday. Voluntary departure, no contest. His termination of parental rights was processed this morning. Gerald paused. Joseph, social services want to discuss something with you. About the adoption process. What about it? The boys have been asking for you. They want to know when you're coming to see them again. Gerald's voice carried unusual emotion. They've been telling their foster parents that you're their real dad, the one who protects people. Joseph felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he'd thought war had burned out of him years ago. Gerald, I'm not father material. I've killed men with my bare hands. I've done things that would give these boys nightmares. Maybe, but you've also protected them when their biological parents failed them. You fought for their future when everyone else was fighting for themselves. Gerald's voice grew serious. What kind of man does that make you, Joseph? As Joseph hung up the phone, he realized that the war he'd been fighting wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about protecting innocence from the consequences of adult failures. Marcus and Michael hadn't chosen their parents or their circumstances, but they deserved a future free from the sins of the past. Tomorrow, the defense would present their case. Tomorrow, Alan Reeves would take the stand and try to convince a jury that he was the victim. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, Joseph had a decision to make about two little boys who saw him as their protector. The question was whether he was brave enough to be the father they needed, or whether his own demons would make him just another adult who failed them. Some battles, he was learning, were fought not with weapons, but with love. And those were often the hardest wars to win. Chapter 7. The Devil's Testimony. Alan Reeves took the witness stand on the third day of trial, his expensive suit unable to mask the desperation in his eyes. His attorney, Cora McGrath, had coached him extensively, but Joseph could see the telltale signs of a man cracking under pressure. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the exit, the sheen of perspiration despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. Mr. Reeves, McGrath began, please tell the jury about your first meeting with Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson. Alan's voice was steady but rehearsed. The sergeant approached me claiming he wanted to establish a relationship with his stepchildren. He offered what appeared to be a legitimate business partnership, security consulting for my construction projects. Did you have any reason to suspect ulterior motives? None at all. He presented himself as a patriotic veteran seeking post-service employment. I wanted to help. Alan looked toward the jury, his expression crafted to convey wounded innocence. I had no idea I was being set up for an elaborate revenge plot. Joseph watched the performance with professional detachment. Alan was good, better than most Taliban commanders he'd interrogated. But like most criminals, Alan's greatest weakness was his inability to resist embellishment. McGrath guided her client through carefully rehearsed testimony. Alan portrayed himself as a successful businessman targeted by an unstable veteran, an innocent man manipulated by a master manipulator with military training in psychological warfare. Did Sergeant Nelson ever threaten you directly? McGrath asked. Constantly. He said he didn't forgive betrayal, that he would destroy anyone who crossed him. He spoke about his combat experience, about hunting men through mountains. Alan's voice carried manufactured fear. I was genuinely afraid for my safety and the safety of my family. U.S. Attorney Marla Schneider's cross-examination began with surgical precision. Mr. Reeves, you testified that you were manipulated into committing federal crimes. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. And these crimes included bribing military officials for classified information? Allen hesitated. I was told the information sharing was legal. Mr. Reeves, I'm going to show you Exhibit 47. Schneider displayed a recording from the warehouse meeting. This is your voice, is it not? Quote, 20% of all contract values paid to offshore accounts. You're clearly discussing bribery here, aren't you? I was confused, frightened. You were negotiating the terms of a criminal conspiracy, weren't you? Schneider's voice carried prosecutorial steel. No one forced you to discuss offshore accounts or percentage payments. Those were your ideas, weren't they? The cross-examination continued for 3 hours, with Schneider systematically dismantling Allen's victim narrative. She presented evidence of his previous construction violations, his pattern of corner cutting, his history of using illegal immigrant labor to maximize profits. Mr. Reeves, how many families were sickened by toxic mold in housing units your company constructed? I don't have exact figures. 47 documented cases, according to base medical records. How many children were hospitalized due to electrical fires caused by substandard wiring in your buildings? Those were isolated incidents. 12 children, Mr. Reeves. 12 children hospitalized because you chose profit over safety. Schneider's voice carried genuine anger now. And you want this jury to believe you're the victim? By the time Schneider finished, Allen looked like a man who'd been run over by a freight train. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the greedy, callous individual beneath. During the lunch recess, Craig Goldstein approached Joseph with urgent news. We have a problem. McGrath is calling character witnesses this afternoon. Military officers who will testify about your concerning behavior and vendetta mentality. Which officers? Colonel Kurt Shepard, your former commanding officer from your second tour. Captain Henry Green from the JAG office. Major Philip Mayo from personnel. Craig looked uncomfortable. Joseph, they're going to testify that you have a documented history of refusing to forgive perceived betrayals, that you once pursued disciplinary action against fellow soldiers for minor infractions. Joseph felt cold anger building. They're using my military record against me. It gets worse. They have documentation of the incident in Kandahar, when you refused to authorize medical evacuation for a wounded Afghan interpreter who'd been feeding information to the Taliban. That interpreter got 3 of my men killed. I know, but McGrath is going to argue it shows a pattern of ruthless behavior toward anyone you perceive as a betrayer. Craig hesitated. Joseph, is there anything in your record you haven't told me about? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Afghan mountains and Taliban caves, about split-second decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. There are things I did over there that were necessary, but not nice. Things that kept my men alive, but wouldn't play well in a civilian courtroom. Anything McGrath could have discovered. Classified operations, mostly. She shouldn't have access. Joseph paused, but Kurt Shepard was there for most of it. If he's willing to testify against me, he might share details that paint me in an unfavorable light. That afternoon, Colonel Shepard took the stand with obvious reluctance. He was a good soldier caught in an impossible position, testifying against a decorated subordinate in a civilian court. Colonel Shepard, McGrath began, you served with Master Sergeant Nelson in Afghanistan. How would you characterize his attitude toward perceived betrayals? Shepard looked directly at Joseph before answering. The sergeant was uncompromising when it came to loyalty issues. He believed in absolute accountability. Can you give the jury a specific example? There was an incident involving an Afghan interpreter. The man had been providing information to enemy forces, which resulted in casualties among our personnel. When the interpreter was wounded in an attack, Sergeant Nelson refused to authorize medical evacuation. The courtroom stirred. McGrath pressed her advantage. A wounded man was denied medical care, based solely on Sergeant Nelson's judgment. The interpreter had betrayed his oath and gotten American soldiers killed. Sergeant Nelson felt medical resources should be reserved for loyal personnel. Shepard's voice carried reluctant admiration despite his testimony. The decision may have been harsh, but it was tactically sound. Colonel, in your opinion, is Master Sergeant Nelson capable of elaborate revenge plots against those he perceives as betrayers? Shepard met Joseph's eyes again. Sergeant Nelson is the most tactically brilliant soldier I've ever commanded. If he wanted to destroy someone, he would have the skills and knowledge to do so effectively. McGrath smiled, thinking she'd scored a victory. But Schneider's cross-examination revealed the deeper truth. Colonel Shepard, how many times did Master Sergeant Nelson risk his own life to save fellow soldiers? Countless times. He has 3 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars for heroism under fire. How many men did he bring home alive who wouldn't have survived without his intervention? Dozens. Possibly hundreds if you count the Taliban fighters who surrendered rather than face him in combat. In your opinion, Colonel, is Master Sergeant Nelson a man who protects innocents or targets them? Shepard's answer was immediate and unwavering. Sergeant Nelson has spent his entire career protecting innocents, ma'am. Whatever he did in this situation, I guarantee it was motivated by protecting someone who needed protection. The afternoon continued with other character witnesses, but the damage McGrath hoped to inflict had been largely neutralized. Joseph's military record, rather than painting him as a vengeful sociopath, revealed a man who'd spent his life making hard decisions to protect others. As court recessed for the day, Joseph received a text message that changed everything. It was from Lou Jarvis, the twins' foster father. Marcus asked me to send this. Says it's important. Attached was a child's drawing. Stick figures representing Joseph, Marcus, and Michael standing together. At the bottom, in crayon, Marcus had written, "My real dad, Joseph." Joseph stared at the drawing for a long moment, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. These boys saw him not as a weapon or a soldier, but as a protector, someone who kept them safe when their world fell apart. Craig Goldstein noticed his expression. "Everything okay?" Joseph folded the drawing carefully, placing it in his uniform pocket next to his heart. "Just remembering what I'm fighting for." Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, jury deliberations, and verdicts. Tomorrow would determine whether justice prevailed or whether good men were destroyed by the machinations of those they tried to protect. But tonight, Joseph had a phone call to make. To social services, to discuss adoption procedures and home studies, and all the bureaucratic necessities of becoming the father 2 little boys believed him to be. The war was almost over. It was time to start thinking about peace. Chapter 8. Verdicts and Vengeance. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Joseph spent the time visiting Marcus and Michael at their foster home, watching them play in a backyard while Lou and Carlos Jarvis discussed adoption procedures with social workers. The boys had adapted well to their new environment, but they still asked when Joseph was coming home to stay. Soon, he told them, meaning it for the first time. Very soon, on Friday morning, the jury returned with their verdict. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Alan Reeves stood to hear his fate. The foreman, a retired military veteran named Randy Simons, read the verdict with military precision. On the charge of conspiracy to commit federal fraud, guilty. On the charge of bribery of military officials, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. The list continued for 17 separate counts. Alan Reeves had been convicted on every charge. As the verdict was read, his face went ashen, his expensive lawyer's confident facade crumbling. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but denied bail pending appeal. "Mr. Reeves, you have systematically defrauded the United States military and endangered the lives of service members and their families. You will remain in federal custody until sentencing." As federal marshals led Alan away in shackles, he looked back at Joseph with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Nelson. I have friends, connections. You'll pay for this." Joseph met his stare without flinching. "Mr. Reeves, you just threatened a federal witness in open court. I don't think you understand how much deeper you just made your hole." Outside the courthouse, Reporters swarmed Joseph, but he issued only a brief statement. Justice has been served. Military families can sleep safely knowing that those who prey on our service members will be held accountable. That evening, Craig Goldstein called with Shelby's plea agreement. Guilty to federal fraud charges, 2 years probation, restitution to the military families affected by Allen's housing projects. She'll avoid prison time, but her financial assets remain frozen pending civil litigation. And the twins. Full termination of parental rights. Both biological parents have relinquished all claims. The boys are free for adoption. Craig paused. Joseph, Social Services wants to fast-track your application. The home study, background investigation, psychological evaluation, they're expediting everything. Joseph looked around his sparse apartment, imagining it filled with children's toys and laughter. How fast? If you're serious about this, Marcus and Michael could be home within a month. Home. The word carried weight Joseph hadn't felt in years. Afghanistan had been a mission. The apartment was a temporary quarters. But home was something worth fighting for. 2 weeks later, Joseph stood in Alan Reeves' former office building, now under federal seizure and scheduled for auction. Gerald Garrison had arranged the private viewing as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings. The government will sell everything, Gerald explained as they walked through the empty corridors. Building, equipment, vehicles, even Alan's personal collection of military memorabilia. Joseph paused before a display case containing medals and awards Alan had never earned, uniforms he'd never worn, photos with military officers who trusted him. Stolen valor? Among other things. FBI found an entire room of fake military credentials, forged discharge papers, fraudulent awards. Gerald shook his head. This man wasn't just a criminal. He was a pathological liar who built his entire identity on deception. In Alan's private office, Joseph found something that made his blood run cold. A wall safe, its contents now spread across federal evidence tables, had contained detailed surveillance files on military families. Personal information, financial records, photographs of children playing in base housing that Alan's company had built. He was targeting military families specifically, Joseph realized, not just for fraud, but for potential blackmail, manipulation, identity theft. Gerald nodded grimly. The scope of his operation was far beyond what we initially discovered. Alan Reeves wasn't just stealing from the military. He was preying on military families like a predator. Joseph felt his hands clench in a fist. Even in prison, Alan represented a continuing threat to innocent families. The legal system had delivered justice, but Joseph knew that justice and protection weren't always the same thing. That afternoon brought unexpected news. Alan Reeves had been found dead in his federal holding cell, an apparent suicide. Prison officials reported that he'd used bedsheets to hang himself, leaving behind a note confessing to crimes that went far beyond the charges he'd faced. Joseph received the news from Craig Goldstein with mixed emotions. Seems he couldn't face the prospect of 20 years in federal prison, Craig said. His lawyer says Alan had been receiving death threats from other inmates, military veterans who didn't appreciate his crimes against service families. Any evidence of foul play? None that I've heard about. Federal Bureau of Prisons is conducting a full investigation, but preliminary findings suggest suicide. Craig paused. Joseph, I have to ask, where were you yesterday evening? Home study appointment with Social Services. Lou and Carlos Jarvis were present, along with the caseworker and child psychologist. Joseph's alibi was airtight, which was exactly how he'd planned it. Why? Just covering all bases. With Alan dead, the defense will try to appeal his conviction, claim he was driven to suicide by prosecutorial overreach. Joseph felt satisfaction rather than sympathy. Alan Reeves had gotten off easy. Death was preferable to decades in federal prison, surrounded by the very veterans he'd betrayed. But his death also meant permanent security for the families he might have continued to threaten. That evening, Joseph received a final text message from Shelby. Alan is dead. The boys ask about you every day. Maybe we could work something out, joint custody, visitation rights. I'm still their mother. Joseph's response was immediate and final. You terminated your parental rights voluntarily. The boys have new parents now, people who put their welfare first. Don't contact this number again. Her reply came quickly. You can't keep me from my children forever. Joseph smiled grimly as he typed his response. Watch me. Then he blocked her number and deleted her contact information. Shelby Nelson was now officially part of his past, a closed chapter in a story that was finally moving toward a happy ending. 2 hours later, his doorbell rang. Joseph opened it to find Marcus and Michael standing in the hallway with Lou Jarvis, each boy carrying a small suitcase and wearing expressions of nervous excitement. Surprise! Marcus shouted. We get to come home. Michael hung back shyly until Joseph knelt to his level. Hey, buddy, ready to live with me? Are you going to be our real dad now? Michael asked seriously. If you want me to be, forever and ever. Joseph felt something he'd thought was dead stir in his chest. Hope, love, the possibility of redemption through protecting innocence rather than destroying enemies. Forever and ever, he promised. As the boys explored their new home, Joseph had spent 2 weeks child-proofing and furnishing it. Lou Jarvis pulled him aside. They're good kids, Joseph. Resilient, smart, kind. They've been through hell, but they've come out stronger. Lou smiled. They're lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one, Joseph replied, watching Marcus and Michael claim their bedrooms with the excitement of children finally coming home. That night, after bedtime stories and careful navigation of new routines, Joseph sat on his couch looking at family photos he'd never thought he'd have. Marcus and Michael asleep in their beds, safe and secure for the first time in their young lives. His phone buzzed with a message from Gerald Garrison. Heard the good news about the boys. You did it, Joseph. You protected them. Joseph typed back. We all did. Thank you for everything. What's next for Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson? Joseph looked toward the bedrooms where his sons slept peacefully, no longer worried about adult wars or betrayals or the complexities of a world that had tried to use them as weapons. Teaching 2 boys how to be good men, he typed. Seems like the most important mission I've ever had. Outside, the city hummed with the endless activity of people living their lives, chasing their dreams, making their mistakes. Some would betray those who trusted them. Some would prey on the innocent. Some would choose profit over honor. And when they did, Joseph Nelson would be there, not as a soldier seeking vengeance, but as a father protecting the future his sons would inherit. The war was over. The peace was just beginning. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months later, Joseph stood in the kitchen of his renovated house, packing lunches for Marcus and Michael's first day at their new elementary school. The sparse apartment had been replaced with a real home, bright walls covered with children's artwork, a backyard with a swing set, and bedrooms filled with toys and books and all the detritus of normal childhood. Dad, I can't find my backpack. Marcus called from upstairs, the word Dad still bringing a smile to Joseph's face every time he heard it. Check your closet, buddy, where you left it last night. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in his school uniform and ready for the day. The shy, withdrawn child from the foster home had blossomed into a confident 7-year-old who spoke fluent Spanish and helped his father with household repairs. Are you nervous about school? Joseph asked, kneeling to adjust Michael's collar. A little. But Marcus says we stick together like you taught us. That's right. Nelson men protect each other. The adoption had been finalized 3 months earlier in a courthouse ceremony that felt nothing like the legal battles that preceded it. Judge Morrison had presided, and when he'd asked the boys if they wanted Joseph to be their legal father, Marcus had stood up in the witness chair and announced, "He already is our real dad." This just makes it official. Now Joseph was learning the complexities of single parenthood, parent-teacher conferences, soccer practice, bedtime negotiations with children who'd inherited their biological father's stubborn streak and their adoptive father's tactical intelligence. Found it. Marcus thundered down the stairs with his backpack, nearly colliding with Johanna Woods from Social Services, who was making her final home visit. Sorry, Miss Woods, Marcus said politely, his manners improving under Joseph's consistent guidance. No harm done, sweetheart. Johanna watched the morning routine with professional satisfaction. How are you feeling about school? Excited. Dad says education is the most powerful weapon we can carry. Joseph winced slightly at hearing his military philosophy repurposed for child rearing, but Johanna just laughed. Your father is a wise man. After the boys left for school, accompanied by Joseph, who'd taken the morning off to ease their transition, Johanna completed her paperwork at the kitchen table. This is my last required visit, she said, but you should know that Marcus and Michael are lucky boys. You've given them stability, security, and love. They've transformed from traumatized children into confident, happy kids. They did the hard work. I just provided a safe place to heal. Don't minimize your role, Joseph. Not every wounded soldier becomes a nurturing father. You chose to channel your protective instincts into building rather than destroying. After Johanna left, Joseph sat in his empty house, enjoying the rare moment of silence. His phone buzzed with a text from Gerald Garrison. Saw the news about Shelby. Thought you should know. Joseph opened the attached news article. Shelby had been arrested in Nevada for identity theft and welfare fraud, using false names to claim benefits she wasn't entitled to. Her pattern of deception had continued even after losing her children and facing federal probation. Joseph felt no satisfaction from her continued downfall. Shelby had become irrelevant to his life the moment he'd chosen his son's welfare over his desire for revenge. She was someone else's problem now, and her children were safe from her manipulations. His laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Colonel Gerald Garrison's face appeared on screen, his expression carrying the same mixture of pride and concern that had characterized their relationship since Afghanistan. How are you adjusting to civilian life, Sergeant? Learning every day, sir. Turns out raising children requires different skills than hunting Taliban, but there's surprising overlap in the patience department. Gerald laughed. Any regrets about leaving military service? Joseph considered the question seriously. He'd taken early retirement to focus on the boys, giving up a military career that had defined him for 15 years. None, sir. This is where I'm needed most. The boys are lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. They saved me as much as I saved them. They discussed mutual friends, former unit members, and the ongoing efforts to improve military family housing standards, a cause that had gained significant momentum following Alan Reeves' conviction and exposure of systemic problems. After the call ended, Joseph walked through his house, noting the changes 6 months of family life had wrought. Children's laughter echoed from the walls. Photos of school events and family outings replaced his military memorabilia. The rigid order of military quarters had given way to the controlled chaos of a home where children were encouraged to be children. At 3 p.m., Joseph was waiting outside the elementary school with other parents, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. When Marcus and Michael burst through the doors, their faces bright with excitement, Joseph felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision since their first meeting. Dad, guess what happened? Marcus reached him first, practically vibrating with energy. Tell me everything. My teacher asked if anyone had family in the military, and I said my dad was a war hero, and she asked me to tell the class about it. And I said you protected people and kept them safe, and everyone thought that was really cool. Michael, always more reserved, simply hugged Joseph's leg and said quietly, I missed you today. I missed you too, buddy. Both of you. As they walked home, the boys chattering about their teachers and classmates and the 100 small dramas of elementary school life, Joseph reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. He'd begun seeking justice and revenge, motivated by betrayal and wounded pride. But somewhere along the way, the mission had changed from destroying his enemies to protecting innocents. Alan Reeves was dead. Shelby was facing the consequences of her choices. Ricardo Santos had been deported and disappeared into whatever life awaited him in Mexico. The adults who had failed these children were gone, their damage contained and neutralized. But Marcus and Michael remained, no longer weapons in other people's wars, but children with futures bright with possibility. They would grow up knowing they were loved, protected, and valued for themselves rather than what they could provide to others. That evening, after homework and dinner and the endless negotiations of bedtime, Joseph tucked his sons into their beds and read them stories about heroes and adventures and the triumph of good over evil. Simple stories with clear morals. Nothing like the complex realities of adult warfare. "Dad," Marcus said as Joseph was turning off the light, "are you going to stay with us forever?" "Forever and always, son. Nothing will ever change that. Even if we're bad sometimes." Joseph smiled, remembering his own father's unconditional love and the security it had provided through his troubled teenage years. Even then, that's what real fathers do. They love their children no matter what. "Michael was worried you might leave like our first dad did." Joseph looked at Michael, who was pretending to sleep but listening to every word. "Michael, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes opened. "Yes, sir. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, you're my sons, and we're a family. Families don't abandon each other. Promise." "I promise." Nelson men keep their word. After the boys fell asleep, Joseph sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. His phone contained dozens of messages from old military buddies, reporters seeking follow-up interviews, and veterans advocates asking him to speak at conferences about military family issues. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was simply a father whose children slept safely in their beds, protected from the complexities of a world that had tried to use them as pawns in adult games. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: parent-teacher conferences, soccer games, scraped knees, and hurt feelings, and all the ordinary crises of raising children. There would be no enemy combatants to track, no classified missions to complete, no life-or-death decisions made in split seconds. Instead, there would be homework help and bedtime stories, Christmas mornings and birthday parties, graduations and first dates, and all the milestone moments that defined a childhood well-lived. Joseph Nelson had spent 15 years protecting strangers in foreign lands. Now he would spend the rest of his life protecting the two people who mattered most: his sons, who had chosen him as their father and trusted him with their futures. The war was over. The peace was everything he'd fought for, and more than he'd ever dared hope to deserve. In the distance, a siren wailed as emergency responders rushed to help someone in crisis. Other people's emergencies, other people's wars. Joseph said a brief prayer for their safety and went inside to check on his sleeping children one more time before bed. Marcus and Michael slept peacefully, their faces relaxed and untroubled, their dreams filled with the security that came from knowing they were loved and protected. Joseph stood in their doorway for a long moment, memorizing the scene, his greatest victory, his most important mission accomplished. Tomorrow, the real work would continue. Not the work of a soldier, but the work of a father. And for the first time in his adult life, Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson was exactly where he belonged. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Perfect Facade. Brett Owens adjusted his Rolex as he pushed 8-year-old Emma on the swing set at Riverside Park. The autumn afternoon painted everything in golden hues, and his daughter's laughter carried on the crisp October breeze. At 42, Brett had built an empire from nothing, starting with a single construction crew and expanding into luxury real estate development across 3 states. His weathered hands and sharp gray eyes told the story of a man who'd clawed his way to the top and never looked back. "Higher, Daddy," Emma squealed, her auburn hair streaming behind her like a banner. She had inherited Kelsey's delicate features, but Brett's fierce determination, even at such a young age. Brett's phone buzzed with another business call, but he ignored it. Saturdays belonged to Emma. It was a rule he'd established when Kelsey started complaining that he worked too much. His wife of 12 years had grown increasingly distant lately, always shopping with her sister Rosa or attending her book club meetings that seemed to run later each week. Brett Owens, he turned to find a woman approaching, mid-30s, blonde, nervous energy radiating from her like heat. She kept glancing around as if someone might be watching. "That's me." Brett's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being in control. He slowed Emma's swing with one powerful hand. "I'm Marion Byers. My husband Dan works at the medical center downtown." She paused, wringing her hands. "Look, this is awkward, but your wife approached Dan last week. She offered him $500 to spend an hour alone with your daughter." The world seemed to tilt. Brett's jaw clenched, and Emma looked between the adults, sensing the sudden tension. "What exactly are you saying, Mrs. Byers?" "Dan told me immediately. He was horrified. We have kids too, and—" Marion's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said she was very specific about wanting Emma to trust him, to be comfortable around him. It didn't sit right with either of us." Brett's mind raced through recent conversations with Kelsey. Her insistence that Emma needed to be more social. Her suggestions that Emma spend time with other adults to build confidence. The new photography hobby that required expensive equipment and private sessions. "Where can I reach your husband?" Brett's voice remained steady, but his knuckles had gone white, gripping the swing's chain. Marion handed him a business card. "He's at the hospital today, but he gets off at 6. Brett, we're parents too. We couldn't just ignore this." After Marion left, Brett sat on the bench watching Emma play, his mind working like the calculating machine that had made him millions. Every successful project required careful planning, and this situation would be no different. But first, he needed information. "Come on, princess. Let's go get some ice cream." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That evening, Brett waited until Kelsey was in the shower before accessing her phone. She'd always been careless with passwords, using Emma's birthday for everything. His wife's betrayal unfolded in a digital trail of text messages, photos, and deleted emails he recovered with software from his security company. The messages with Javier Heath started innocuously 6 months ago. Compliments about her appearance at Emma's school events. Suggestions for coffee dates that became lunch meetings, then afternoon encounters at the Riverside Hotel. But the recent messages made Brett's blood turn to ice. "The little girl is perfect. Exactly what we discussed. When can you arrange it?" "Brett travels next week. Emma will be with the babysitter Tuesday. She trusts easily. Payment as discussed. Half now, half after." Brett's hands shook as he scrolled through Javier's responses. This man had been grooming his wife to deliver Emma into a situation that Brett couldn't even fully comprehend without losing his sanity. When Kelsey emerged from the bathroom, humming softly and wrapping her robe around her slim frame, Brett was sitting on their bed, her phone in his hands. "Honey, is everything okay?" She stopped when she saw his expression. "Get dressed, Kelsey. We're going for a drive." "What?" "It's almost 10 o'clock, and Emma's asleep. Emma's coming with us." Brett's voice carried a finality that made Kelsey step back. "You're going to wake her up, tell her we're going to get ice cream, and the three of us are going to take a little trip downtown." Something in Brett's tone made Kelsey's face go pale. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it when she saw the way he was looking at her, like a predator that had cornered its prey. 20 minutes later, they pulled into the parking lot of the downtown police station. Emma slept in her car seat, clutching her stuffed elephant. Kelsey sat rigid in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow. "Brett, please, whatever you think." "Shut up." He turned to face her, and she saw something in his gray eyes that made her blood freeze. "You sold our daughter, Kelsey. You took money to hand her over to a predator." I would never hurt Emma." "You already have." Brett got out of the car and opened Emma's door. She stirred sleepily as he lifted her out. Inside the station, Detective Randall Ferguson listened as Brett laid out everything he'd discovered. Ferguson, a veteran with 20 years on the force, had seen enough to remain calm while taking notes, but his jaw tightened as Brett showed him the text messages. "Mr. Owens, we'll need to examine the phone, interview your wife, and bring in this Javier Heath for questioning. You did the right thing coming here." Brett nodded, but his mind was already working beyond the immediate legal implications. The police would handle their part, but Brett Owens had never relied on others to solve his problems. What Detective Ferguson told him next changed everything. "Sir, I have to inform you that Javier Heath is already on our radar. He's been under surveillance for suspected involvement in a network we've been tracking for 8 months. Your wife's communications might be the break we've been looking for." Brett felt something cold and calculating settle in his chest. Kelsey hadn't just betrayed their family. She'd unwittingly connected him to something much larger. And that gave him options he hadn't considered. As they drove home in silence, Emma sleeping peacefully in the back seat and Kelsey staring out the window with tears streaming down her face, Brett began planning. The legal system would take its course, but justice and revenge were two different things entirely. By the time they reached their house, Brett had already decided that both Kelsey and Javier Heath would pay a price that went far beyond anything the courts could impose. Chapter 2. Gathering Ammunition. The next morning dawned gray and cold, matching Brett's mood as he sat in his home office reviewing security footage from his construction sites. He'd built his reputation on being thorough, and now that same methodical approach would serve a different purpose entirely. Emma was at school, unaware that her world had shifted overnight. Brett had explained to her that Mommy wasn't feeling well and needed a rest, which wasn't entirely untrue. Kelsey had locked herself in the guest bedroom after Brett calmly informed her that she would not be leaving the house until further notice. Javier Heath, Brett muttered, studying the man's social media profiles on his computer screen. 38 years old, divorced, worked as a medical equipment sales representative. His LinkedIn showed a successful career, charity work, and a bright smile that probably charmed parents at school functions. Brett's phone rang. "Detective Ferguson. Mr. Owens, we've arrested Heath." He lawyered up immediately, "But we found some interesting items during our search warrant execution. However, I need to tell you something about your wife's involvement." "I'm listening." "She's not just a victim here. The communications suggest she was actively recruiting for Heath's operation. Your daughter wasn't going to be his first target." The words hit Brett like a physical blow, but his voice remained steady. "How many others?" "We're still investigating, but it appears your wife received payments for at least 3 previous introductions over the past year. Parents who trusted her judgment about babysitters and tutors." After hanging up, Brett sat in his leather chair, staring out at the manicured lawn that Kelsey had insisted on hiring a service to maintain. She'd always been good at creating perfect surfaces while hiding rot underneath. His private investigator, Isaac Moore, called an hour later. Brett had put Isaac on retainer years ago for business due diligence, but now he had a different assignment. "Brett, I've got what you asked for. Heath's been running this operation for at least 2 years, but here's the interesting part. He's not the one at the top. There's a network, and your wife was being groomed to become a regional coordinator." "What does that mean?" "It means she was actively building a client base of vulnerable children and families. The money she was receiving was performance-based. The more successful introduction she made, the more her cut increased." Brett closed his eyes, processing the magnitude of Kelsey's betrayal. It wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was calculated, ongoing participation in something monstrous. "Isaac, I need you to dig deeper. I want to know everything about Heath's operation, his associates, his routines, his weaknesses. And I want to know exactly how much money Kelsey made from this." "Already on it. But Brett, be careful. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, just give me the information." Brett spent the afternoon reviewing his business contacts, identifying resources he might need. His construction company had connections throughout the city: electricians, plumbers, concrete suppliers, demolition crews. Men who knew how to build things and, when necessary, make them disappear. At 3 o'clock, he picked up Emma from school, maintaining the routine to keep her world stable. She chattered about her day, her art project, her friend's upcoming birthday party. Brett listened, responding appropriately, while his mind calculated distances, timelines, and opportunities. "Daddy, is Mommy really sick?" Emma asked as they drove past the ice cream shop where they'd been headed the previous night. "Mommy made some bad choices, sweetheart. Grown-up choices that have consequences. Like when I didn't clean my room and lost my tablet time. Something like that." Brett squeezed her small hand. "But you don't need to worry about it. Daddy's going to take care of everything." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Brett confronted Kelsey in the guest room. She looked haggard, her usually perfect blonde hair unkempt, her makeup smeared from crying. "The police told me about the other children," Brett said, closing the door behind him. Kelsey looked up from the bed where she'd been sitting in her robe, hugging a pillow. "I never meant for it to go this far." Javier said it was just about giving kids opportunities to build confidence with adult mentors. "Don't." Brett's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you didn't know exactly what you were doing. Brett, please. You made $50,000 over the past year, Kelsey. 50,000 pieces of silver for selling children to a predator." Her face crumpled. "I thought we needed the money. You're always working, always stressed about the business. We have $3 million in our personal accounts alone. This wasn't about money." Brett pulled out a folder and dropped it on the bed. Inside were printouts of her text messages, bank records, and photos Isaac had compiled showing her meeting with Heath and other associates. This was about the thrill, wasn't it? The secret life, the feeling of being special, being trusted with something important. Kelsey's silence was answer enough. "Here's what's going to happen," Brett continued, his voice calm and methodical. "You're going to cooperate fully with the police investigation. You're going to provide every detail about Heath's operation and everyone involved. And then you're going to disappear." "What do you mean?" "I mean you're going to leave town, change your name, and never contact Emma or me again. You'll sign over all parental rights and take nothing from our marriage except the clothes on your back." "You can't make me." Brett stepped closer, and Kelsey shrank back against the headboard. "The alternative is that I make sure every parent in this city knows exactly what you did. Every detail. I'll put billboards up with your picture and your crimes. I'll make sure you can never show your face anywhere without someone recognizing you as the woman who sold children to predators." "Brett, Emma needs her mother. Emma needs protection from her mother." Brett's gray eyes were cold as winter steel. "You have 24 hours to decide. Cooperate and disappear, or face the consequences of refusing." He left Kelsey sobbing in the guest room and went to his office to review Isaac's latest report. Javier Heath owned a cabin in the mountains, 2 hours north of the city. He had a pattern of taking long weekends there, usually alone. His ex-wife lived across the country, and they had no children together. Most importantly, Heath had made bail that afternoon, a detail Detective Ferguson had forgotten to mention. Brett smiled for the first time since the playground encounter. A man who preyed on children shouldn't be walking free, and Brett Owens had never been one to wait for the system to do what needed to be done. He opened his safe and removed the .45 caliber pistol he'd carried in the Army, before he'd learned that building empires was more profitable than fighting wars. Some lessons from his military service, however, were about to prove valuable again. By midnight, Brett had a plan that would ensure Javier Heath never threatened another child, and that everyone who'd enabled him would face consequences proportional to their crimes. The police investigation was just beginning, but Brett's personal war was about to commence. Chapter 3: The Trap Springs. Brett stood in his driveway at 5 a.m., loading camping gear into his black Ford F-350. To any observer, he was a father taking a weekend trip to decompress after a family crisis. The reality was considerably more complex. Emma was spending the weekend with Kelsey's sister Rosa, who remained blissfully unaware of the previous week's revelations. Rosa had always disliked Brett, considering him too controlling and demanding, but she adored Emma and jumped at the chance to help during what she assumed was a rough patch in the marriage. "Remember what we discussed?" Brett told Kelsey as she sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She'd agreed to his terms, choosing exile over exposure, but the paperwork wouldn't be finalized for several days. "I meet with the lawyer Monday morning, sign everything, and leave Tuesday," she whispered. "And if you get any ideas about running to the media or trying to spin this as some kind of misunderstanding, I won't." Her voice was barely audible. "I know what I did. I know what I am." Brett nodded and walked out, leaving his wife to contemplate the ruins of her life. He had no sympathy to spare for her. The drive to Heath Mountain Cabin took exactly 97 minutes, following back roads that Brett had scouted twice during the week. Isaac's surveillance had confirmed that Heath arrived Friday evening and typically stayed until Sunday afternoon, using the isolation to conduct video calls with associates who believed he was simply conducting business from a remote location. Heath had no idea that Brett knew about the cabin, or that his bail conditions prohibiting internet access and contact with minors were about to become irrelevant. The cabin sat on 50 acres of wooded property, accessible only by a private dirt road. Heath's silver BMW was parked outside, and smoke rose from the chimney into the cold morning air. Brett parked his truck a quarter-mile away, hidden behind a stand of pine trees, and checked his equipment one final time. He moved through the forest with the silent efficiency he'd learned during 3 tours in Afghanistan. Approaching the cabin from the rear, where thick evergreens provided cover to within 20 yards of the structure. Through the kitchen window, he could see Heath making coffee, wearing a robe, and looking relaxed despite being out on bail for child endangerment charges. Brett waited. Patience had always been his strongest weapon in business negotiations, and this situation required the same methodical approach. At 10 a.m., Heath's phone rang. From his position, Brett could hear parts of the conversation through the thin cabin walls. "No, I told you. We need to lay low until this blows over." The woman was supposed to be reliable. "Yes, I understand the timeline, but rushing now could expose everyone." Heath was still actively coordinating with his network, despite his bail conditions. Brett smiled grimly and activated the recording device he'd brought, insurance for later. When Heath stepped onto the rear deck to continue his call privately, Brett made his move. "Don't turn around and don't raise your voice," Brett said calmly, pressing the barrel of his pistol against the base of Heath's skull. "End the call. Now." Heath's body went rigid. I'll call you back," he managed, then lowered the phone. "Hands behind your back." Brett zip-tied Heath's wrists with the kind of heavy-duty restraints his construction crews used for securing materials. Then he guided the man back inside the cabin and secured him to one of the heavy wooden kitchen chairs. "Brett Owens, I assume," Heath said, his voice steadier than Brett had expected. "You're making a serious mistake." "Am I?" Brett pulled up a chair and sat facing his prisoner. "Let's talk about mistakes, Javier. Like thinking my wife was reliable enough to deliver my daughter to you. I don't know what she told you, but she told me everything. The police told me more. But I'm not here for confessions." Brett placed a digital tablet on the table, showing Heath surveillance photos Isaac had compiled. The man entering hotels with different women over the past year, meeting with known associates of child trafficking networks, and conducting business at locations that had been flagged by federal investigators. "Your operation is finished," Brett continued. "Your associates are scrambling to cover their tracks. Your buyers are going to ground. And you're going to help me understand exactly how this worked. I want a lawyer. You're not under arrest. This is a business conversation between 2 entrepreneurs." Brett stood and walked to the kitchen, where he'd noticed Heath had been preparing what looked like breakfast for 2 people. "Expecting company?" Heath's silence was answer enough. "Gerard Elliott," Brett said, reading a name from one of the documents Isaac had provided. "Your partner in this venture. He's supposed to arrive this afternoon to discuss damage control, isn't he?" Still no response. Brett returned to his chair and leaned forward. "Here's how this is going to work, Javier. You're going to call Gerard and confirm your meeting. You're going to act completely normal. And when he arrives, we're going to have a 3-way conversation about accountability. And if I refuse?" Brett's smile was cold as Arctic wind. "Then I'm going to spend the next several hours demonstrating some techniques I learned in the Army for extracting information from uncooperative subjects. Techniques that leave no permanent physical damage, but create very lasting psychological impressions." He pulled out his phone and showed Heath a video Isaac had compiled. Security footage of Heath approaching children at various public venues over the past 6 months, always with Kelsey or another woman to provide social cover. Every parent of every child you targeted is going to receive a copy of this footage, along with your home address, your work information, and a detailed explanation of what you attempted to do to their children. Heath's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. This network has protection. From who? Local politicians? Police supervisors? Federal agents?" Brett laughed. "I've been building government contracts for 15 years, Javier. I know exactly which officials can be bought and which ones can't. And I know that none of your protection extends to what happens in these mountains. At 2 p.m., Gerard Elliott's black Escalade appeared on the dirt road leading to the cabin. Brett had positioned Heath back in his chair, hands zip-tied behind him, but concealed by a blanket, making it appear he was simply resting. "Remember," Brett whispered, pressing the gun against Heath's ribs, "act normal, or this becomes very unpleasant very quickly." Elliott knocked once and entered without waiting for a response, clearly familiar with the cabin and Heath's routines. He was a large man in his 50s, expensively dressed despite the remote location, with the kind of soft features that suggested wealth and comfort. "Javier, we need to discuss." Elliott stopped when he saw Brett. "Gerard Elliott, I presume. Please have a seat." Elliott's hand moved toward his jacket, but Brett's gun was already pointed at his chest. "I wouldn't. Hands where I can see them." Within minutes, Elliott was secured to another chair, his confident demeanor replaced by the kind of fear that comes from suddenly realizing you're no longer in control. "Gentlemen," Brett said, pouring himself a cup of Heath's coffee, "let's discuss the future of your organization. Or rather, the complete dismantling of it." Over the next hour, Brett extracted details about the network's operations, financial structure, and client base. He recorded everything, building a comprehensive case file that would destroy not just Heath and Elliott, but their entire operation. "You realize," Elliott said during a brief pause, "that eliminating us won't end this. Others will take our place." "Maybe," Brett agreed, "but they'll know what happens to people who threaten my family." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Brett made 2 phone calls. The first was to Detective Ferguson, providing GPS coordinates and explaining what he'd uncovered. The second was to Isaac, confirming that certain arrangements had been finalized. "The police will be here in about an hour," Brett told his prisoners. "That gives us time for one final conversation about consequences." He produced a tablet showing bank account information Isaac had compiled, offshore accounts, shell companies, and financial networks the 2 men had used to launder their profits. "I've transferred every dollar you made from this operation to accounts supporting organizations that help traffic children. Consider it restitution. You can't just steal." "I didn't steal anything. I recovered proceeds from criminal activity and directed them toward their highest use. It's called justice." Brett checked his watch. 45 minutes until the police arrived. Enough time to ensure that Heath and Elliott understood the full scope of what Brett Owens was capable of when someone threatened his family. By the time Detective Ferguson's team reached the cabin, they found Heath and Elliott secured with evidence of their entire operation laid out systematically. Both men were alive, but exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma that no amount of therapy would completely heal. Brett was long gone, driving back toward the city where he had one final piece of business to conclude with his wife. The network was dismantled, the immediate threat neutralized, but Brett's personal war was not yet finished. Chapter 4. Loose Ends. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself was mocking the cold reality of Brett's new world. He sat in his lawyer's office, watching Kelsey sign document after document with a shaking hand. Her sister Rosa waited outside, still believing this was an amicable divorce rather than the systematic destruction of a child predator's accomplice. The house transfer, all business assets, and full custody of Emma, attorney Richard Wells confirmed, sliding the final papers across his mahogany desk. Mrs. Owens retains nothing except her personal effects and the $5,000 we discussed for relocation expenses. Kelsey looked up at Brett with hollow eyes. "That's it? 12 years of marriage for $5,000. "You earned every penny," Brett replied coldly. "Consider yourself fortunate you're walking away with anything." The news coverage of Heath and Elliott's arrest had dominated local media for 3 days. Federal investigators were now involved, unraveling a network that spanned multiple states. Kelsey's cooperation with authorities had kept her name out of the headlines, but that protection would end the moment she violated their agreement. "The bus leaves at 3 p.m., Brett told her as they stood outside the law office. "Isaac will be watching to make sure you're on it." "Brett, Emma will ask about me." "Emma will be told that her mother chose to leave." Which is the truth? Kelsey started to speak, then stopped. She understood that any argument would only remind Brett of other reasons to ensure her complete destruction. Instead, she nodded and walked toward Rose's car, where her sister waited with questions Brett hoped she'd never learn to ask. At Emma's school, Brett arranged a meeting with Principal Joan Herring and the guidance counselor, Amber Beard. Both women had been following the news coverage and understood the situation without requiring detailed explanations. Emma's been through a traumatic experience, even if she doesn't fully understand it yet, Ms. Beard explained. Children are remarkably resilient, but she'll need stability and honesty appropriate to her age level. She'll have both, Brett assured them. What she won't have is any contact with people who might exploit that trauma for their own purposes. Principal Herring nodded. We've already implemented additional security measures. No one except you and your designated emergency contacts can pick up Emma or have any communication with her during school hours. Brett had spent the weekend carefully considering how to explain Kelsey's absence to Emma. The truth, filtered through age-appropriate language, seemed the kindest approach. That evening, as Emma worked on homework at the kitchen table, Brett sat down beside her. Princess, we need to talk about Mommy. Emma looked up from her math worksheet, her green eyes, so much like Kelsey's, filled with the kind of trust that Brett would spend the rest of his life protecting. Is she still sick? Mommy made some very bad choices that hurt people. Because of those choices, she can't live with us anymore. Will she come back when she's better? Brett's chest tightened. No, sweetheart. She won't be coming back. Emma processed this information with the practical acceptance that children often display in crisis situations. So it's just you and me now? Just you and me. Is that okay? Emma considered this seriously, then nodded. You're the best daddy anyway. Mommy always seemed sad, even when she was smiling. The insight from his 8-year-old daughter hit Brett harder than he'd expected. Children notice things that adults missed, and Emma had apparently sensed Kelsey's dissatisfaction long before Brett had acknowledged it. Daddy loves you more than anything in the world, Brett said, pulling her into a hug. Nothing will ever change that. The following week brought a steady stream of developments. Heath and Elliot had both been denied bail after federal charges were filed. Their network had included 12 other individuals across 4 states, all now under investigation. The media coverage praised the anonymous tip that had led to their capture, never suspecting that the tipster had been personally involved in their interrogation. Isaac stopped by Brett's office Friday afternoon with a final report. Heath's cabin has been sold to a hunting club. Elliot's assets have been seized by federal authorities. And your wife? Isaac paused, checking his notes. She successfully boarded the bus to Denver on Monday and hasn't been seen in this area since. Good. Any word on the other families involved? The children Heath targeted are all receiving counseling. Their parents have been informed about the network's scope, and several are pursuing civil litigation against Heath's estate. Brett nodded, satisfied that the immediate threats had been neutralized. But one loose end remained. That weekend, Brett took Emma camping at Pine Lake, 2 hours south of their city. It was a trip they'd planned before the crisis, and maintaining normal activities seemed important for her emotional recovery. As they sat by their campfire Saturday evening, Emma roasting marshmallows with intense concentration, Brett's phone rang. Detective Ferguson. Brett, I wanted to give you an update. Heath provided information about a federal operation targeting child trafficking networks. His cooperation might reduce his sentence significantly. Brett's jaw tightened. What kind of reduction? Potentially 15 years instead of life without parole. That's unacceptable. I understand your frustration, but no, detective, you don't understand. That man orchestrated the exploitation of children. My wife helped him target my daughter. 15 years isn't justice. After ending the call, Brett stared into the fire, considering options. The legal system had provided partial satisfaction, but true justice required a more personal touch. Emma had fallen asleep in her camp chair, exhausted from a day of hiking and fishing. Brett carried her into their tent, tucking her sleeping bag around her small form. She looked so innocent, so trusting, that the thought of what might have happened if he hadn't discovered Heath's plan made his hands shake with rage. He stepped back outside and called a number he'd hoped never to use again. Frank Erickson speaking. Frank, it's Brett Owens. A pause. Frank had served under Brett in Afghanistan, where they developed the kind of bond that forms between soldiers who depend on each other for survival. Frank now worked private security contracts, the kind of work that didn't appear on official records. Jesus, Brett. I heard about the situation on the news. How's Emma? She's safe. But the man who targeted her is going to get a reduced sentence for cooperation. Another pause, longer this time. I see. What do you need? A conversation. In person. Can you meet me Tuesday? I'll be there. Brett ended the call and returned to watching the fire burn down to embers. Justice delayed was justice denied, and Brett Owens had never been patient with systems that failed to deliver appropriate consequences. By Tuesday, he would have a plan to ensure that Javier Heath never threatened another child, regardless of what deals he might make with federal prosecutors. Some lessons from the Army had never left him, and some enemies didn't deserve the protection of civilized society. Chapter 5. Federal Complications. Tuesday morning brought unexpected developments that would test Brett's carefully laid plans. He was reviewing construction schedules in his office when Detective Ferguson called with news that changed everything. Brett, we have a problem. Heath's been moved to federal custody at an undisclosed location. The trafficking investigation has expanded beyond anything we initially understood. Brett set down his coffee, instantly alert. What does that mean for the local charges? They're being absorbed into a federal case involving multiple agencies. FBI, Homeland Security, U.S. Marshals. Heath isn't just cooperating. He's become a protected witness. The implications hit Brett immediately. Federal protection meant Heath would be isolated from any form of personal justice, potentially relocated with a new identity if his testimony proved valuable enough. Detective, that man was hours away from assaulting my daughter. I understand your frustration, but this is bigger than what happened to your family. Heath's information has already led to arrests in 3 other states. After hanging up, Brett sat in his leather chair, calculating options. Federal protection wasn't impenetrable, but it required resources and connections beyond what most civilians could access. Fortunately, Brett Owens wasn't most civilians. Frank Erickson arrived at Brett's office an hour later, looking every inch the professional soldier despite wearing civilian clothes. At 45, Frank retained the lean build and alert eyes that had made him one of Brett's most reliable subordinates in Afghanistan. You look like hell, Frank observed, settling into the chair across from Brett's desk. I feel worse than I look. What do you know about federal witness protection protocols? Frank's expression grew serious. More than I should. Why? Brett explained the situation, watching Frank's face harden as the details emerged. Frank had 2 daughters of his own, ages 10 and 12. Protected witness, Frank said when Brett finished. That complicates things significantly, but not impossibly. Nothing's impossible, but it would require resources, timing, and considerable risk. Brett leaned forward. Name your price. It's not about money, Brett. We served together. I owe you my life from that IED incident in Kandahar. But this could bring federal heat down on both of us for the rest of our lives. And if it was one of your daughters Heath had targeted? Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the construction cranes dotting the city skyline. Federal facilities have vulnerabilities. Prisoner transport has weak points. Even protected witnesses occasionally have accidents. I'm listening. Give me 48 hours to make some calls. I still have contacts and agencies that might be relevant to this situation. After Frank left, Brett spent the afternoon reviewing financial records, preparing to liquidate assets if necessary. Some goals justified any cost, and ensuring Heath never threatened another child was worth sacrificing everything Brett had built. That evening, Emma sat at the kitchen table working on a school project about family history. She'd asked pointed questions about why there were no recent photos of Kelsey in the house, accepting Brett's explanation that some pictures made him sad right now. Daddy, Ashley's mom wants to know if you'd like to join their book club, Emma said, gluing construction paper on a poster board. Brett looked up from his laptop. Ashley was Emma's best friend, and her mother, Nikki Buckley, was a pediatric nurse who'd been divorced for 3 years. Emma had mentioned her several times recently. What kind of books do they read? Boring grown-up books, probably. But Ashley says there's wine and cheese, and her mom thinks you're handsome. Emma Grace Owens, did you just try to set me up on a date? Emma giggled. Maybe. Ashley says her mom gets lonely sometimes, and you're lonely too even though you try to hide it. The insight from his 8-year-old daughter was both touching and unsettling. Brett had focused so intensely on business and revenge that he hadn't considered how his emotional state might be affecting Emma. Tell Ashley's mom that I appreciate the invitation, but Daddy has some work things to finish first. Ashley says her mom is very pretty and makes good cookies. I'm sure she does, Princess. Wednesday brought news that tested Brett's patience further. Isaac called with an update on Heath's federal status. He's been moved again, this time to a facility in Virginia. The FBI has him in deep protection while they build cases against his network associates. Word is he's providing information about international connections. International. Apparently, Heath's operation was connected to trafficking networks in Eastern Europe. His cooperation could dismantle organizations that have been operating for decades. Brett understood the federal perspective. Heath's information could save hundreds of children from exploitation. But understanding didn't equal acceptance, and it certainly didn't satisfy Brett's need for personal justice. Frank called that afternoon with an update that shifted the entire dynamic. I've been making inquiries, Frank said. Heath isn't just in federal protection. He's been fast-tracked for witness relocation. If his testimony proves valuable enough, he could be out of prison in 5 to 7 years with a completely new identity. That's unacceptable. There's more. My contact at the U.S. Marshal Service says Heath has been asking about your family's current status. Specifically, he's been inquiring about Emma's school, your address, and your business locations. Brett's blood turned cold. Why would a protected witness need that information? Exactly what I asked. The official answer is that Heath is concerned about potential retaliation affecting his cooperation. The unofficial answer is more troubling, which is, Heath's attorney is suggesting that your confrontation at his cabin constituted illegal detention and assault. He's building a case that you're an ongoing threat to his safety. Brett gripped his phone tighter. So he's trying to claim victim status, while simultaneously positioning himself for maximum federal protection. It's a smart legal strategy, assuming his goal is avoiding real consequences for his actions. After ending the call, Brett sat in his office, staring at the photo of Emma on his desk. Heath wasn't just escaping justice. He was using the system to ensure his protection while maintaining interest in Brett's family. That level of calculated manipulation confirmed Brett's assessment. Some people couldn't be reformed, deterred, or contained by legal means. They could only be eliminated. By Thursday evening, Brett had made his decision. Frank's contacts had provided enough information about Heath's protection protocols to develop a workable plan. It would require significant resources, careful timing, and accepting the possibility of life-changing consequences. But as Brett tucked Emma into bed and listened to her prayers, he knew that some risks were worth taking. His daughter deserved to grow up in a world where predators faced real consequences for their actions. Daddy, Emma said as he turned off her bedroom light, Ashley's mom is coming to my school play next week. She said she hopes you'll be there too. I'll be there, Princess. I wouldn't miss it. Promise? Brett kissed her forehead. Promise. He meant it, but first he had to ensure that Javier Heath never posed a threat to Emma or any other child ever again. Some promises required extreme measures to keep. Chapter 6. The Point of No Return. The federal courthouse in Virginia looked imposing against the gray October sky as Brett sat in his rental car across the street, watching U.S. Marshals escort prisoners to various hearings. Frank sat beside him, studying the building's security through high-powered binoculars. Third floor, East Wing, Frank said quietly. That's where they're holding Heath for his testimony sessions. Brett checked his watch. How long until the next transport? 2 hours. He'll be moved back to the detention facility at exactly 3 p.m. Same route they've used for the past week. They've been conducting surveillance for 3 days, identifying patterns in federal security protocols. Frank's contacts had provided inside information about Heath's schedule, including the detail that most interested Brett. Heath's transport was vulnerable during a specific 2-minute window on the route back to detention. "You sure about this?" Frank asked, lowering the binoculars. "Once we move, there's no going back. Federal agents don't forget, and they don't forgive." Brett thought about Emma's school play tomorrow evening, about her innocent trust that Daddy would always protect her, about the life she deserved to live without looking over her shoulder for predators who'd escaped justice. "I'm sure." At 2:45 p.m., they moved to their predetermined position, a construction zone where Frank's connections had arranged for legitimate roadwork that would provide cover for what was about to happen. Brett's construction company had worked federal contracts before. His crews knew how to coordinate with law enforcement for traffic control. The transport van appeared exactly on schedule, following the same route it had used all week. 2 U.S. Marshals in the front, Heath and another prisoner in the rear compartment. No chase car, because this was supposed to be a routine movement between secure facilities. Frank's improvised explosive device, small, precise, designed to disable rather than destroy, detonated under the van's front axle. The vehicle lurched to a stop, steam rising from the damaged engine compartment. Brett and Frank approached from opposite sides, wearing construction worker safety vests and hard hats that made them invisible in the work zone. The marshals were already calling for backup and medical assistance, focused on the mechanical failure they assumed had occurred. "Need assistance, officers?" Brett called out, jogging toward the van with a concerned expression. "Stay back, sir. Federal transport. I'm a contractor working this zone. We've got medical equipment and tools if you need them." The distraction lasted exactly long enough for Frank to access the rear compartment through techniques he'd learned during specialized military training. Heath was unconscious from the impact, making the extraction considerably easier than Brett had anticipated. 7 minutes later, Heath was secured in the back of Brett's truck, still unconscious but breathing. The marshals were dealing with backup units and investigators trying to determine if the mechanical failure was sabotage or coincidence. By the time federal agents realized Heath was missing, Brett and Frank were already 50 miles away, heading toward a location Frank had prepared for exactly this contingency. The abandoned mining facility in West Virginia had been closed for 15 years, its underground passages extending miles into the mountain. Frank had used similar locations for training exercises with private military contractors, places where sound didn't carry and satellite surveillance couldn't penetrate. Heath regained consciousness as they were carrying him into the mine's main shaft. The look of recognition in his eyes when he saw Brett was satisfying in a way that no federal conviction could have provided. "This is kidnapping of a federal witness," Heath said, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "You'll both face life sentences, assuming anyone finds you," Frank replied, securing Heath to a chair they positioned in one of the larger chambers. Brett pulled out a folding table and arranged the documents Isaac had compiled, evidence of Heath's crimes that went far beyond what federal investigators had uncovered. Financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, photographs of victims from multiple states, communications with international trafficking networks. "Let's discuss accountability," Brett said, sitting across from Heath in the underground chamber. "You're going to receive a reduced sentence for cooperation. 5 to 7 years for orchestrating the exploitation of dozens of children. I provided valuable intelligence. You provided information to save yourself while continuing to get." Brett slid a tablet across the table showing surveillance footage Frank's contact had obtained. Heath during federal debriefing sessions, asking detailed questions about the families he'd targeted, ostensibly to help investigators but actually to satisfy his own continued obsession. Even in federal protection, you couldn't stop thinking about the children you'd missed. Heath's silence confirmed Brett's assessment. "Frank, show him what we found in his protected witness housing." Frank produced evidence bags containing items that had been concealed in Heath's federal facility. Sketches of children, maps of school districts, and notes about families with single parents who might be vulnerable to manipulation. "You were planning to resume operations after your testimony was complete," Brett continued. "New identity, new location, same victims. You can't prove. I don't need to prove anything. Federal courts require evidence and due process. I require only certainty. Brett stood and walked deeper into the mine shaft, where Frank had prepared additional equipment. When he returned, Heath's composure finally cracked. What do you want? Money? I can access accounts. I want justice. The kind that ensures you never threaten another child. Over the next hour, Brett extracted confessions about crimes that would never see court proceedings, details about victims who would never receive legal closure, and admissions about plans that would never be implemented. Frank recorded everything, creating a final record of Heath's true nature that would be distributed to victims' families and law enforcement agencies. Please, Heath said as Brett prepared the final phase of his plan. I'll disappear. New identity, different country. You'll never hear from me again. You're right, Brett agreed. I'll never hear from you again. The mining shaft had deep pools of acidic water left from decades of industrial operations. Bodies that entered those pools were never recovered, dissolved completely by the chemical processes that continued long after the mining operations ceased. Any last thoughts about the children you destroyed? Brett asked. Heath's final words were a combination of pleas and threats that confirmed every assumption Brett had made about his character. Some people couldn't be reformed or deterred. They could only be eliminated. As the sun set over the West Virginia mountains, Brett and Frank were already driving back toward Virginia. Heath's disappearance would trigger a massive federal investigation, but the mining facility had been chosen specifically because it provided no evidence trail. Brett arrived home Friday evening just in time to shower and change clothes for Emma's school play. She performed beautifully as a fairy in the Halloween production, her face lighting up when she spotted him in the audience. Nikki Buckley was indeed very attractive, and she did make excellent cookies, which she shared with Brett after the performance while their daughters played together backstage. Emma's talked about you quite a bit, Nikki said, her brown eyes warm with interest. She's mentioned you as well. Something about book clubs and loneliness. Nikki laughed. She's quite the little matchmaker. Though I should mention, I usually prefer my first dates to involve less premeditation from 8-year-olds. So this is a date. If you'd like it to be. Brett looked across the gymnasium at Emma, who was giggling with Ashley while they collected their costume accessories. His daughter deserved a stable, happy life, and maybe that life could include other people who understood the importance of protecting children. I like that very much. As they made plans for dinner the following weekend, Brett reflected on the events of the past month. Justice had been served, threats had been eliminated, and life was moving forward. The federal investigation into Heath's disappearance would continue for months, but it would ultimately conclude that a protected witness had somehow vanished without a trace. One of those bureaucratic failures that occasionally occurred in complex cases. Brett Owens had protected his family, ensured appropriate consequences for those who'd threatened them, and was now free to focus on building a future rather than seeking revenge. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the personal cost. Chapter 7. Federal Heat. 3 weeks after Heath's disappearance, FBI Special Agent Darren Vaughn arrived at Brett's office unannounced. Brett was reviewing blueprints for a new hospital complex when his secretary informed him that federal agents were requesting an immediate meeting. Mr. Owens, I'm investigating the disappearance of federal witness Javier Heath, Agent Vaughn said, settling into the chair across from Brett's desk. He was younger than Brett had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of intense focus that suggested either ambition or genuine dedication. I read about that in the news. Something about a transport vehicle malfunction. You were aware Mr. Heath was in federal custody? Detective Ferguson kept me informed about the case involving my family. I assumed Heath would be in custody given the charges. Agent Vaughn consulted his notes. You confronted Heath at his mountain cabin. You extracted confessions. You provided evidence that led to federal charges. I provided evidence that proved my wife was facilitating child exploitation. Heath's federal charges were based on what authorities discovered independently. Mr. Owens, where were you on October 15th between 2 and 4 p.m.? Brett pulled out his phone and scrolled through his calendar. Meeting with the City Planning Commission about permit approvals for the Riverside Heights project. I can provide witnesses. And Frank Erickson? When did you last speak with him? Brett's expression didn't change, though internally he noted that federal investigators had identified Frank's involvement. Frank's an old Army buddy. We grab beers occasionally when he's in town. He was in town October 15th. Was he? I didn't see him that day. Agent Vaughn studied Brett for a long moment. Mr. Heath was providing information about an international trafficking network. His testimony could have saved hundreds of children from exploitation. Then it's unfortunate someone decided he was worth more dead than alive. Who says he's dead? Brett shrugged. Missing federal witness, no ransom demands, no communication. Either he's dead or he's escaped federal protection to resume his activities. Either way, he's not saving any children. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with Agent Vaughn probing for inconsistencies in Brett's timeline and connections to Heath's disappearance. Brett answered every question directly while providing no useful information. After the agent left, Brett called Frank using a disposable phone purchased specifically for such communications. Federal visit? Frank asked. Agent Vaughn. Professional, thorough, suspicious. They're interviewing everyone with connections to Heath. My former commander got a visit yesterday. Are you concerned? Not yet, but we should assume ongoing surveillance and act accordingly. That evening, Brett attended Emma's parent-teacher conference, followed by dinner with Nikki and Ashley. Their relationship had developed naturally over the past 3 weeks, providing Emma with the stable family environment she needed while giving Brett something positive to focus on. You seem distracted tonight, Nikki observed as they sat on her porch after the children had gone inside to watch a movie. Work stress. Federal contracts involve a lot of bureaucracy. Nikki studied his face in the porch light. Brett, I work with traumatized children every day at the hospital. I recognize the signs of someone carrying heavy burdens. Brett considered how much truth he could share with a woman he was beginning to care about deeply. Emma's been through a difficult time with her mother's departure. I'm still working through my own emotions about that situation. The news coverage mentioned child endangerment charges against someone connected to your family. Someone who will never threaten children again. Something in Brett's tone made Nikki lean back slightly. That sounds very final. Some threats require permanent solutions. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, both understanding that certain topics would remain unspoken between them. Nikki was intelligent enough to read between the lines, and compassionate enough to recognize that some actions, while legally questionable, might be morally justified. The following week brought increased federal pressure. Agent Vaughn returned with additional questions, this time accompanied by a federal prosecutor who outlined potential charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to interfere with federal investigations. We know you're involved, Mr. Owens, the prosecutor said. Heath's disappearance required planning, resources, and inside information about federal security protocols. That points to someone with military experience and significant financial resources. It also points to dozens of other potential suspects, Brett replied calmly. Heath victimized children across multiple states. Any parent whose child was targeted would have motivation to ensure he faced appropriate consequences. Are you suggesting vigilante justice? I'm suggesting that when the legal system fails to protect children adequately, parents might seek alternative solutions. Agent Vaughn leaned forward. The legal system was working. Heath was cooperating fully with federal investigators. Heath was manipulating federal investigators while planning to resume his activities under a new identity. His cooperation was calculated self-interest, not genuine reform. The accusation hung in the air between them. Brett had no way to prove his claim without revealing how he'd obtained the information, but the federal agents couldn't disprove it without acknowledging gaps in their own investigation. After they left, Brett spent the afternoon reviewing security for his home and business. Federal surveillance was sophisticated, but it wasn't impenetrable. If they intended to build a case against him, he needed to ensure they found nothing useful. That weekend, Brett took Emma and Ashley to the state fair, maintaining normal activities while federal agents observed from a distance. Nikki joined them for the evening fireworks display, creating the appearance of an ordinary blended family enjoying simple pleasures. "Daddy, why are those men following us?" Emma asked as they walked toward the car. Brett looked back to see Agent Vaughn and his partner attempting to blend in with the crowd. Sometimes adults have to watch other adults for work reasons. Like when you have to watch Ashley's little brother at the playground. That seems boring. Very boring, princess. As they drove home, Brett noticed the surveillance vehicle maintaining careful distance behind them. Federal agents were skilled, but Brett had learned counter-surveillance techniques during his military service that remained effective against domestic law enforcement. By the following Tuesday, Brett had identified patterns in the federal surveillance that would allow him to move freely when necessary. More importantly, he'd received information from Isaac that changed the entire dynamic of the federal investigation. "They've lost interest in Heath," Isaac reported during their weekly meeting. New intelligence suggests he was eliminated by associates who considered him a liability rather than by victims seeking revenge. What kind of intelligence? Communications intercepted from Eastern European trafficking networks. Apparently, Heath's cooperation exposed operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His former partners had more motivation to eliminate him than any domestic victims. Brett smiled grimly. Frank's military contact had apparently planted evidence suggesting international involvement in Heath's disappearance, directing federal attention away from domestic suspects. "Agent Vaughn still considers you a person of interest," Isaac continued, "but the investigation is shifting focus toward international organized crime. How long before I'm cleared? Federal bureaucracy moves slowly, but you should see reduced surveillance within a month. They can't justify continued resources on domestic suspects when international evidence suggests otherwise." That evening, Brett sat on his back deck, watching Emma and Ashley play in the yard while Nikki prepared dinner in his kitchen. The domestic scene felt both natural and surreal after the violence of the past month. "Everything okay?" Nikki asked, bringing him a beer and settling into the chair beside him. "Getting better. Work complications are resolving themselves." "Good. Emma needs stability right now. And frankly, so do you." Brett reached over and took her hand. "What we're building here, it's important to me. It's important to all of us." As the sun set behind the trees, Brett reflected on the changes in his life. Justice had been served, federal heat was diminishing, and he was building something positive with a woman who understood that protecting children sometimes required difficult choices. The federal investigation would eventually conclude without charges. Heath would never threaten another child, and Brett's family would move forward without looking over their shoulders. Some victories came at a high price, but they were still victories. Chapter 8. New Foundations. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, with snow falling steadily outside Brett's house. Emma and Ashley were already awake, examining presents under the tree while Nikki made coffee in the kitchen. The scene felt wonderfully normal after months of chaos and federal scrutiny. "Daddy, look what Santa brought." Emma held up a new digital camera, her face glowing with excitement. Brett smiled, remembering Kelsey's obsession with photography equipment for very different purposes. Emma's interest in taking pictures of flowers and pets represented innocence reclaimed. "That's wonderful, princess. Maybe you can take some pictures of our Christmas dinner." Nikki appeared in the doorway, wearing one of Brett's sweaters and looking perfectly at home in his kitchen. They'd been officially living together for 2 months, and the arrangement benefited everyone involved. Emma had a stable maternal figure. Ashley had a father presence she'd never known, and Brett had found unexpected happiness with a woman who understood his priorities. Agent Vaughn called yesterday, Nikki mentioned quietly while the girls were distracted with their gifts. Brett looked up sharply. "Why would he call you?" "Routine follow-up. He wanted to confirm that you were with me on certain dates when federal witnesses were being interviewed. And I confirmed that you've been focused entirely on family and work since we started dating. Nothing about international travel or mysterious activities." Brett nodded, appreciating Nikki's casual deflection of federal inquiries. She'd never asked direct questions about Heath's disappearance, but her medical background had given her insight into trauma responses and the lengths parents might go to protect their children. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Brett answered to find Isaac Moore standing on his porch, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Sorry to interrupt Christmas, but we need to talk." Brett stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What's wrong?" Federal investigation officially closed yesterday. Heath's disappearance has been attributed to international organized crime retaliation. No domestic charges will be filed. Brett felt tension he hadn't realized he was carrying finally released from his shoulders. That's good news. There's more. Kelsey's been found. The news hit Brett like a physical blow. Where? Denver morgue. Apparent suicide 3 weeks ago. She left a detailed confession about her involvement with Heath's operation, absolving you of any knowledge or participation. Brett processed this information carefully. Kelsey's final act had been to protect the family she betrayed, ensuring that Emma would never face questions about her father's actions. Does Emma need to know? That's your call. The confession will become part of the federal case file, but there's no requirement to inform minor children about deceased parents' criminal activities. Brett looked through the window at Emma, who was showing Ashley how to adjust the camera settings. His daughter had adapted well to life without her mother, and introducing new trauma seemed unnecessarily cruel. I'll tell her when she's older. For now, Mommy went away and isn't coming back. Isaac nodded and handed Brett an envelope. Kelsey's final letter, addressed to you personally. After Isaac left, Brett sat in his truck reading Kelsey's handwritten confession. She detailed her involvement with Heath's network, her recruitment of other families, and her gradual realization that she'd become something monstrous. The letter concluded with an apology that felt both genuine and inadequate. "I know you'll never forgive me, and you shouldn't. But please don't let my actions poison Emma's memories entirely. I loved her, even if I lost sight of what that meant." Brett folded the letter and put it in his safe, next to other documents Emma might need to understand her history when she became an adult. Inside the house, Nikki was helping the girls set up a board game while Christmas music played softly in the background. "Everything okay?" she asked when Brett returned. "Loose and's getting tied up." That afternoon, Brett called Frank to share the news about the federal investigation's conclusion. "International organized crime," Frank said with satisfaction. "My contacts did excellent work planting that evidence trail. What's your next move?" "Back to private security work, probably overseas. I've had offers from companies that value my particular skill set." "Frank, thank you. We're even now, Brett. Take care of your family." New Year's Eve found Brett and Nikki hosting a small party for neighbors and friends. Emma and Ashley served as co-hostesses, taking their responsibilities seriously while enjoying the adult attention. "This time last year, I never imagined my life would look like this," Nikki confided as they watched midnight fireworks from the back deck. "Good different or bad different?" "Wonderful different. Emma's given Ashley the sister she always wanted, and you've given me something I thought I'd never find again." Brett pulled her closer, marveling at how much his life had changed in 12 months. The previous New Year's Eve, he'd been focused on business expansion while his wife plotted to sell their daughter to a predator. Now he was building a legitimate family with a woman who shared his values about protecting children. "I have something for you," Nikki said, producing a small wrap box. Inside was a simple gold band engraved with coordinates, the latitude and longitude of the playground where they'd first met at Emma's school event. "Nikki, I'm not proposing," she said quickly, "but I wanted you to have something that represents new beginnings. Places where good things start." Brett slipped the ring onto his right hand, touched by the gesture's symbolism. "I love you. I love you too. All of you, including the parts you think are too dark to share." As winter gave way to spring, Brett's life settled into comfortable patterns. His construction company continued expanding, with new federal contracts proving that his reputation remained intact despite the Heath investigation. Emma thrived in school, her natural intelligence complemented by the emotional stability Nikki provided. Ashley integrated seamlessly into their family structure, calling Brett Dad within 6 months of their parents' relationship beginning. The anniversary of Heath's disappearance passed without media coverage or federal attention. The case had been officially resolved, filed away with thousands of other crimes attributed to international organized crime networks. Brett occasionally thought about the abandoned mining facility in West Virginia, where justice had been served outside the boundaries of legal systems. He felt no remorse for Heath's fate, only satisfaction that a predator would never threaten another child. Some actions couldn't be undone, but they also didn't require justification. Protecting innocent children from exploitation was a moral imperative that transcended legal technicalities. On Emma's 9th birthday, as Brett watched her blow out candles surrounded by friends and the family they'd built together, he reflected on the choices that had brought them to this moment. The price of justice had been high, but the alternative, allowing Heath to escape consequences and potentially harm other children, had been unacceptable. Brett Owens had protected his family, eliminated threats to their safety, and built something beautiful from the ruins of betrayal. Some victories were worth any cost. Chapter 9. Legacy Secured. 2 years later, Brett stood in the maternity ward of St. Mary's Hospital, holding his newborn son through the nursery window. James Brett Owens had arrived 3 hours earlier, completing the family that had grown from tragedy and violence into something genuinely beautiful. "He looks like you," Nikki said from her hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "Poor kid," Brett replied, though his voice carried pure joy. Emma and Ashley pressed their faces against the nursery window, comparing their new brother to other babies and declaring him obviously superior in every measurable category. "Daddy, when can we take him home?" Emma asked. "Tomorrow, princess. Then you and Ashley get to be the best big sisters in the world." The girls beamed with pride at their elevated status, already planning the ways they would spoil and protect their baby brother. As Brett held his son for the first time, he thought about the legacy he was building. James would grow up in a world where predators faced real consequences for their actions, where family meant protection and loyalty, and where justice wasn't confined to court proceedings. Dr. Nikki Owens had officially become Mrs. Owens 6 months earlier, in a small ceremony attended by friends and extended family. Isaac Moore had served as Brett's best man, while Emma and Ashley shared maid of honor duties. The wedding marked not just a union between two adults, but the formal recognition of a family that had been functioning as one for over a year. "I have news," Isaac said when he arrived to visit the new baby that afternoon. Brett looked up from feeding James's bottle. "Good news or complicated news? Depends on your perspective. Gerard Elliott died in federal prison last week. Apparent heart attack, though prison medical care isn't known for thorough autopsies." Brett nodded without surprise. Frank's network included people with various specialties, and federal prison wasn't as secure as most people believed. Any federal interest in investigating? Elliott was serving a life sentence with no possibility of parole. His death saves taxpayers money and closes a case file. No one's asking questions. That evening, as Brett sat in his study reviewing construction contracts while his family slept, he reflected on the complete resolution of the Heath network. Every major player had faced consequences proportional to their crimes. Every threat to children had been eliminated, and every victim's family could rest assured that justice had been served. His phone rang. Frank Erickson, calling from somewhere in Eastern Europe where he was providing security for humanitarian operations. "Congratulations on the new addition," Frank said. "Thank you. How did you know?" "Isaac sends updates. I wanted you to know that the last loose end has been tied up." Brett understood the coded message. Elliott's death meant that no one remained alive who could connect Brett to Heath's disappearance or the broader network's destruction. "I appreciate your thoroughness. We take care of our own. Give my regards to your family." The line went dead, and Brett deleted the call from his phone's memory. Frank would continue his work protecting innocent people in conflict zones around the world, while Brett focused on building and protecting his own family's future. Emma appeared in his study doorway, wearing her pajamas and carrying her stuffed elephant. "Daddy, I had a bad dream." Brett pulled her onto his lap, holding his 9-year-old daughter close. "What was it about?" "Someone trying to take baby James away from us." Brett's jaw tightened briefly before he forced himself to relax. Emma's subconscious was processing fears based on experiences she didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as threatening. No one will ever take James away from us, Princess. Daddy won't let that happen. Promise? I promise. Our family is safe now. Emma nodded against his chest, trusting completely in her father's ability to protect them all. The next morning, Brett brought his expanded family home to a house that had been thoroughly security upgraded over the past 2 years. Cameras monitored every approach, motion detectors covered the perimeter, and panic rooms provided safe refuge if threats ever materialized. More importantly, Brett had established relationships with local law enforcement, federal agencies, and private security firms that would ensure rapid response to any threats against his family. It's beautiful, Nikki said, looking around the nursery Brett had prepared for James. Soft colors, expensive furniture, and security systems disguised as decorative elements created an environment that was both nurturing and protected. Only the best for our son. As spring turned to summer, the Owens family settled into routines that balanced normal childhood experiences with necessary security precautions. Emma and Ashley attended summer camps with background check counselors, played in neighborhoods where Brett knew every resident, and participated in activities where trusted adults provided supervision. James thrived under the attention of his sisters and the protection of parents who understood that safety required constant vigilance. On the second anniversary of Heath's disappearance, Brett took Emma fishing at Pine Lake, the same location where they'd camped after her mother's betrayal was discovered. "Daddy, do you think Mommy would have liked James?" Emma asked as they sat by the water. Brett considered his response carefully. Emma had never asked direct questions about Kelsey's departure, accepting the explanation that Mommy had made bad choices and couldn't live with him anymore. "Your Mommy loved you very much, Princess. If she had been a better person, she would have loved James too. But she wasn't a better person." "No, sweetheart, she wasn't." Emma nodded, accepting this assessment with the pragmatic wisdom children often display about complex adult situations. "I'm glad Nikki is our mommy now. She makes better choices." "Yes, she does." That evening, as Brett put James down for the night while Nikki helped the girls with homework, he reflected on the family he'd built from the ashes of betrayal. Emma was developing into a strong, intelligent young woman who understood that the world contained both good and evil, and that good people sometimes had to fight to protect what mattered most. Ashley had blossomed under stable parental guidance, her grades improving and her confidence growing as she learned that families could be built on trust and protection rather than fear and uncertainty. James would grow up knowing only love, security, and the certainty that his family would sacrifice anything to keep him safe. Nikki had proven herself worthy of the trust Brett placed in her, understanding without being told that some questions shouldn't be asked and some truths didn't need to be spoken. As Brett sat in his study that night, updating his will to ensure his family's security would continue even if something happened to him, he considered the choices that had brought him to this moment. Javier Heath had received justice outside the legal system, but justice nonetheless. His network had been destroyed, his associates eliminated, and his victims could rest assured that he would never threaten children again. Kelsey had faced consequences for her betrayal, making the ultimate payment for her crimes while ensuring that Emma would be protected from the full truth of her mother's actions. The federal investigation had concluded without charges, Heath's disappearance attributed to international criminals who left no witnesses or evidence. Brett Owens had protected his family, eliminated threats to their safety, and built something beautiful and lasting from the ruins of betrayal and violence. Some victories required extreme measures, but they were still victories. His children would grow up safe, loved, and protected by a father who understood that some lines should never be crossed, and that those who crossed them anyway faced consequences that transcended legal boundaries. Justice had been served, family had been protected, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Brett closed his laptop and went upstairs to check on his sleeping children, listening to their peaceful breathing and feeling satisfied that he'd built something worth protecting at any cost. In the end, that's what mattered most: family, loyalty, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect innocent children from those who would harm them. Some lessons were worth teaching, regardless of the personal price. And some fathers would pay any price to ensure their children's safety and future happiness. Brett Owens was one of those fathers, and his family would always be protected by a man who understood that true justice sometimes required stepping outside the boundaries of law and civilization. The price of betrayal had been paid in full, and the legacy he was building would endure long after the memories of violence had faded into history. Some stories ended with justice served and families protected. This was one of those stories. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.